I never believed in haunted houses until I stood in front of the Peterson place. It's strange, growing up in a town like Whispering Pines, where everyone knows everyone, yet some things remain buried, like the house at the edge of town. It had been almost 30 years since the fire. I was a kid back then, too young to understand what really happened. But I remember the funeral, the way people whispered about it for weeks, and then, suddenly, nobody talked about it at all. The ruins of the Peterson house sat untouched, a skeletal reminder of something everyone tried to forget. Now, as a detective, I was back in Whispering Pines, staring at those same blackened beams. 7 deaths. That's how many bodies had turned up on this property since the fire. People fell, tripped, suffered unexplained accidents, and no one had an answer, just stories, just rumors. The Petersons were the first, and then, every few years, someone else would meet a similar end. Brutal, and always under mysterious circumstances. The most recent death, a local teenager, had pushed the town over the edge, demanding answers. So they sent me, the hometown kid, to figure it out. Stepping onto the charred ground felt wrong, like I was trespassing, not just on property, but on memory. The trees surrounding the house were overgrown now, twisting around the remains of the Peterson home like they were protecting something, hiding it. I could almost hear my mother's voice in my head, warning me to stay away from this place. She'd been one of those people who'd sworn there was something evil about the fire. It wasn't an accident, she used to say. There was more to it. At the time, I thought she was being dramatic. Now I wasn't so sure. As I walked through what was left of the house, I noticed how untouched some things were. The kitchen tiles were still intact under a layer of dirt and debris. I bent down, running my hand over the smooth surface, trying to imagine the family that had lived here, their last moments. It felt eerie, how the house still held on to bits of its past, as if it refused to let go, as if it wanted to remind us of what happened. But it wasn't just the house that bothered me. It was the way the town had reacted. The people I grew up with, the ones who had always been so open, so quick to share stories, they went silent when I brought up the Petersons. Every conversation ended with a forced smile, a quick change of subject, or a muttered, "Let it be." It wasn't just fear, it was something else. Like they knew something. Like they were protecting something. I stood up, my gaze drifting to the spot where Tommy Peterson's body had been found, his toy untouched beside him. That part had always stayed with me, even as a kid. How could everything burn so completely, and yet that toy, that small piece of plastic, remain unscathed? The wind picked up as I stood there, looking at the place where Tommy's body had been found. I remember hearing the story as a kid, how the fire consumed everything, but his toy, that stupid little truck, was left untouched. It didn't make sense. None of it ever did. But back then, I didn't question things the way I do now. I crouched down, sifting through the dirt and ash with my fingers, half expecting to find something. What? I didn't know. But the ground here felt heavy, like it held onto secrets, like it was waiting for someone to dig them up. I shook my head, telling myself I was overthinking it. This was just an old house that burned down. That's it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more, something just beyond what I could see. I stood up and wiped the dirt from my hands, looking around the ruins. The town may have tried to forget this place, but it still stood here, a reminder. And then there were the deaths, 7 over the course of 40 years. None of them made any sense. The latest one, the teenager, had just been passing through. He hadn't even known the Petersons. Yet here he was, dead, found on the same ground where the Petersons had burned alive. People said he fell, hit his head. But there was something off about that explanation, something that didn't sit right with me. I left the house and made my way back to my car, the crunch of leaves under my boots the only sound. The road out of here was narrow, winding through trees that seemed to close in the further you drove. Whispering Pines had always felt separate, like a world of its own. Coming back after all these years, I felt like I'd never left. The air felt thicker here, the kind of place where secrets didn't stay buried. Back in town, I headed straight for the station. My head was buzzing with questions, with the image of that house stuck in my mind like an itch I couldn't scratch. I had files on all 7 deaths, scattered across the years. But the more I looked at them, the more I noticed the patterns. It wasn't just the location, it was the people. Every one of them had a connection to the Petersons, even if it was distant, even if it was just a whisper. I laid out the files on my desk, staring at the names, the photos. It was right there, staring me in the face. The Petersons had been dead for decades, but somehow they were at the center of this. It wasn't a haunting. I didn't believe in that sort of thing. But it was something worse. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Chief Reynolds standing in the doorway, arms crossed. "You're still digging into that old house?" His voice had that same tone people had been using with me since I got back. Like they knew something I didn't and didn't want me to find out. "Yeah," I said, glancing back at the files. "Something doesn't add up." "It never does," Reynolds muttered, shaking his head. "Leave it be, Charlie. Some things are better left in the past." He walked off before I could respond, but his words hung there, settling in like a weight on my shoulders. Reynolds' words stuck with me longer than they should have. Some things are better left in the past. That kind of thinking is why nothing ever got solved in this town. Whispering Pines had always been good at pretending things didn't happen, sweeping them under the rug until people just stopped asking questions. But not this time. I couldn't let it go. I sat at my desk long after everyone had gone home, the low hum of the overhead lights the only sound keeping me company. The files were spread out in front of me, their contents spilling out like they were begging to be put together. 7 deaths, all with vague explanations. Accidents, they called them. A fall, a drowning, a car wreck. But the more I stared at the names and faces, the more it felt like a puzzle that someone had deliberately scrambled. My eyes kept drifting back to the Petersons. John and Mary Peterson, the perfect couple. Church every Sunday, active in the community. John ran the local hardware store. Mary baked pies for the church fundraisers. No one ever had a bad word to say about them. Until the fire. After that, the town's memory of them seemed to fade, like they'd never existed. And Tommy, God, that kid was always smiling. He couldn't have been more than 5 when he died. It never sat right with me, how people just moved on from a family like that, like they'd been erased. I flipped through the coroner's reports again. Same conclusions every time. Nothing out of the ordinary, no signs of foul play. But something about the phrasing struck me as too neat, too rehearsed. It was like they were repeating a script, not actually investigating. It wasn't just the Petersons. Every death after theirs had that same eerie finality to it, as if someone had decided the answer before the question was even asked. There was a knock at the door, sharp and unexpected. I jumped, scattering the papers across my desk. "Come in," I said, my voice hoarse. The door creaked open, and I saw Martha, the town librarian, standing in the doorway. She looked nervous, her hands clutched around an old, tattered book. "I heard you were looking into the Petersons," she said quietly, stepping inside and glancing around like she was worried someone might see her. "I thought you should have this." She placed the book on my desk. It was a dusty old thing, worn leather cover, no title. I flipped it open and scanned the first few pages. Old town records, handwritten notes, newspaper clippings from the 60s and 70s. The Peterson name came up more than once. "Martha, where did you get this?" I asked, my pulse quickening. She hesitated, looking over her shoulder before speaking again. "It's been in the library's archives for years. No one ever looks at it, but I remembered seeing the Petersons' name. I thought maybe it could help." She paused, her voice dropping even lower. "There are things about that family, about this town, that people don't like to talk about, things that go back before the fire." Before I could ask her more, she was gone, slipping out the door like she'd never been there at all. I sat there, staring at the book. Part of me didn't want to open it, didn't want to know what was buried in those pages. But I knew I had to. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was in that book was the key to understanding what happened in Whispering Pines. I stared at the book for a long time after Martha left, trying to push back the unease creeping into my thoughts. This wasn't like me. I didn't get spooked by old records or town gossip, but something about the way she handed it over, the way she barely spoke above a whisper, made me feel like I was holding something I wasn't supposed to have, like there was a reason no one had looked at it in years. I opened it slowly, the pages brittle under my fingers, yellowed from decades of dust and neglect. The handwriting was shaky in parts, like whoever had written it was in a hurry, or maybe afraid. Some of the dates went back to the late 60s, long before the fire, long before I was even born. But the Petersons' name came up again and again, woven into the town's history in ways I hadn't expected. They weren't just another small-town family. They were tied to everything. Land deals, disputes over property, rumors of bribes, and a strange recurring mention of a group called the Council. I paused at that. The Council. I'd never heard of anything like that in Whispering Pines. It wasn't in any of the official records, but the way the name was scribbled down, almost hidden between lines, made me think it wasn't something people were supposed to talk about. There were references to meetings, to secret decisions about the town's future, and the Petersons seemed to be at the center of it all. They weren't just a good, quiet family. They were important, powerful, and maybe dangerous. Flipping through more pages, I came across old clippings from the local paper. One, in particular, stood out. It was dated 1978, just a few months before the fire. The headline was simple: "Local family threatened over land dispute." The article mentioned John Peterson by name, saying he had received anonymous threats regarding the sale of a piece of land just outside the town's limits. It didn't seem like much at the time, just a disagreement over property lines. But now, looking at it with fresh eyes, it felt like a warning. A piece of a larger puzzle that no one had bothered to fit together. A cold realization started to settle in. Maybe the fire wasn't just a tragic accident. Maybe it was the final move in a game that had been playing out for years, one that had ended in death. But if that were true, why did everyone in town pretend it didn't happen? Why had they let the Petersons' deaths go unexplained for so long? And more importantly, who was still keeping those secrets buried? I slammed the book shut, feeling a wave of frustration. The pieces were there, scattered in front of me, but none of them fit the way they should. The deaths, the fire, the cover-ups, it all pointed to something bigger, something darker than just a family's bad luck. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I was getting too close to it, that maybe this was why everyone had warned me to leave it alone. As I sat there, the dim light of the station casting long shadows across the room, I felt the weight of the town pressing down on me. I had grown up here, surrounded by people I thought I knew, but now it felt like they were all strangers, hiding something I hadn't been meant to find. I couldn't stop now. The truth was right there, just out of reach. I couldn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw flames. The Peterson house burning, the screams of a family trapped inside. But it wasn't just the fire. It was the way the town looked away, the way they all pretended like it never happened. It was the council, the threats, the secrets. It was everything whispering in the back of my mind, telling me to stop, to walk away before I ended up like them. The next morning, I drove straight to the library. I needed answers. Martha was already there, waiting. Her eyes were tired and she barely glanced up when I walked in. "I knew you'd come back," she said, her voice soft but resigned. "No one who opens that book ever leaves it alone." She led me down into the basement archives, a place that smelled like dust and mildew, where the town's history was buried in boxes and forgotten newspapers. She didn't say much as she pulled out another stack of old documents, but there was something in her eyes, a fear, maybe even guilt. "They kept records," she said, her voice shaking. "About the council, about the Petersons, about the others. They were all part of it, Charlie, all of them." I stared at the papers in front of me, feeling that same sense of dread settle in my chest. The council wasn't just a group of men who made decisions for the town. They controlled everything: land, money, lives. The Petersons had crossed them, and for that, they were erased. And everyone who came too close, who asked too many questions, they were erased too. The accidents, the deaths, they weren't accidents at all. They were warnings. Warnings to anyone who dared to dig too deep. My throat tightened as I realized what this meant. I was next. The council had been watching me from the moment I reopened the Peterson case. Every step I took, every question I asked, it was all being monitored, and now I was too close. Too close to the truth. I glanced at Martha, wondering how she'd survived all these years with this knowledge. Maybe she knew they'd come for her eventually, too. Maybe that's why she was helping me now, trying to clear her conscience before it was too late. I grabbed the papers and left without saying another word. My hands shook as I drove back to the station. I couldn't stop thinking about all the people who died, all the families that had been torn apart because of these secrets. I was furious, but I was also scared. Scared of what would happen when they realized I knew the truth. Scared of who I could trust, if anyone. When I got to the station, Reynolds was waiting for me. His face was stone, unreadable. I walked past him, my heart pounding, but he grabbed my arm, stopping me. "Let it go, Charlie," he said quietly. There was no anger in his voice, just a strange kind of sadness. "You don't know what you're getting into." I pulled my arm free and looked him dead in the eye. I know exactly what I'm getting into. But the moment I said it, something shifted in him. It was subtle, just a flicker of his eyes, a tightening of his jaw. That's when it hit me. The council, the deaths, the Petersons. He wasn't just a bystander, he was part of it. All this time, he'd been one of them. I backed away, my pulse racing. Reynolds didn't follow. He didn't need to. His warning had already sunk in. This wasn't just about the past anymore. It was about now, about me. The council had been protecting their secret for decades, and they weren't going to let me expose it. I drove out of Whispering Pines that night, but as I looked in the rearview mirror, I realized something. You can leave a town, but you can't outrun what's buried there. Not when it's still breathing. I've been a cop for over 20 years, seen my fair share of strange things, but nothing like that night out at the old Miller farm. It was supposed to be a routine call, just some local boys who stumbled across a grave while messing around in the woods. At first, I thought it might be one of those family plots, you know, the kind that gets forgotten when the land changes hands. But something about the tone in the dispatcher's voice made me uneasy before I even got there. When I pulled up, the place was exactly how I remembered it. Run down, overgrown, like nobody had touched it in decades. The old barn was barely standing, and the house wasn't much better. The kids were long gone, but the sheriff's deputy, Mike, was waiting for me by the edge of the field. He waved me over, his face grim. "Back here," he said, leading me past the overgrowth. "You're not going to believe this." We walked to a clearing, and sure enough, there it was, a patch of freshly disturbed dirt, maybe 4 feet wide. The ground was uneven, like someone had tried to cover something up in a hurry. My first thought was animals, maybe a hunter burying a carcass, but Mike had already brushed some of the dirt away, and what was underneath wasn't anything natural. Bones. Human bones. Old, by the looks of them. Yellowed, brittle, like they'd been there for a long time. But there was something about the way they were arranged that made my skin crawl. It wasn't random. It looked intentional, like they had been placed there carefully. "How old do you think this is?" I asked, kneeling down to get a closer look. Mike shrugged. "Too old to be anyone local. But I don't know, Evan. Doesn't feel right." He was right about that. I stood up and looked around. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. Not in the sense that someone was watching us, more like the land itself had eyes. I told Mike we'd need to bring in someone from the county to take a closer look, but I could tell neither of us wanted to stick around any longer than we had to. I didn't sleep much that night. My wife kept asking what was wrong, but I just told her it was work. Nothing new, just another weird case out in the sticks. She nodded, didn't push. That's one thing about being married to a cop, you learn when to stop asking questions. But the truth was, I couldn't stop thinking about that grave. The way those bones were laid out, the way the air felt wrong as soon as we started digging. It stuck with me, gnawing at the back of my mind like I'd missed something important. The next morning, I drove back to the site with a couple guys from the county coroner's office. We had orders to excavate the rest of the grave and see what we were really dealing with. The air was colder than usual for that time of year, biting at my skin even through my jacket. As we started digging, I tried to focus on the task, but every so often I'd get this strange sensation, like the ground beneath me was shifting. I told myself it was just nerves, but I wasn't convinced. The deeper we went, the more unsettling it became. The bones weren't just scattered, they were arranged in a pattern, something deliberate. One of the guys, Joe, paused mid-shovel and glanced up at me. "Evan, you seeing this?" He pointed to a cluster of bones at the bottom of the hole. They were arranged in a circle, almost too precise to be natural. My heart started racing. "Yeah," I muttered, wiping the sweat from my brow. "I see it." As we unearthed more, the strangeness only grew. We found rocks placed around the perimeter of the grave, each with symbols carved into them. The carvings were crude but distinct, like they'd been etched by hand. I didn't recognize the symbols, but they gave me a bad feeling, like we were disturbing something we had no business messing with. The whispers started around noon. At first, I thought it was the wind playing tricks on me, but then I realized the others heard it too. Joe stopped, his face pale, looking around like he was expecting to see someone standing nearby. There was nobody, just us, the bones, and that godforsaken field. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't answer right away. I was too busy listening, straining to catch the sound again. It was faint, like voices carried from far away, but unmistakable. Whispering. Words I couldn't understand. My mouth went dry, and I felt this cold grip settle in my chest. Something wasn't right here, and every instinct I had was telling me to get the hell out. I stood there, shovel still in hand, trying to make sense of the whispers. It wasn't like they were loud, but they were there, just enough to mess with your head. The sound came from all around us, almost like the ground itself was speaking. I didn't want to admit it, but I could see the same fear in Joe's eyes. He wasn't the type to get rattled easily, and seeing him like that made my stomach twist. "We should stop," he said, his voice shaky. "Get someone else out here, someone who knows what the hell this is." I wanted to agree. Hell, everything in me was screaming to get out of there, to call it a day, and let the suits handle it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that leaving now, with whatever we dug up, wouldn't be any better. We were already in too deep, literally. Something had been waiting down there, and we'd brought it up to the surface. Turning our backs on it now wouldn't make it go away. "No," I said, though I barely recognized my own voice. "We finished this." Joe looked at me like I'd lost my mind, and maybe I had. But something about those bones, those symbols, it felt like if we left now, we'd be leaving something unfinished, something that would come back for us. I couldn't explain it, but I knew it was real. We kept digging, slower now, each shovel full of dirt, heavier than the last. The whispers didn't stop. They grew softer, more rhythmic, like a chant just below the surface of my hearing. I tried to block it out, focus on the task, but every so often I'd catch movement out of the corner of my eye, a shadow darting between the trees or a figure in the distance. When I turned to look, there was nothing there. At one point, I thought I saw someone standing near the tree line, just watching us. My heart leapt into my throat and I froze, but when I blinked, they were gone. Just gone. I didn't say anything to Joe. What was the point? I wasn't sure what I'd seen, and I didn't want to spook him any more than he already was. We hit something solid. Not more bones. This was different. A slab of stone, buried deeper than the bones themselves. I knelt down, brushing away the dirt, revealing more of the symbols carved into its surface. These weren't random markings. They were deliberate, precise. I couldn't read them, but I knew they weren't just decoration. "What the hell is this?" Joe asked, his voice barely a whisper. I didn't answer. I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that we were standing on something ancient, something we should have never uncovered. My hands trembled as I reached out, running my fingers over the cold stone. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, like they were trying to tell me something, trying to warn me, or maybe trying to draw me in. I pulled my hand back, heart racing. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was beneath that stone, it was meant to stay buried, and we'd just woken it up. The stone slab sat there, half buried, daring me to touch it again. I stood over it, my pulse hammering in my ears, telling myself to back away, to leave it alone. But I couldn't. It was like the thing was pulling at me, calling out in a way I couldn't explain, like it had been waiting for someone to find it, and now that we had, it wasn't letting go. Joe was pacing behind me, mumbling under his breath, his nerves shot to hell. I didn't blame him. "We need to get out of here," he said, more to himself than to me. His shovel dropped with a dull thud, but I barely noticed. My eyes were locked on the carvings, my fingers tingling from where I'd touched the stone. There was this heavy feeling in my chest, like something was sitting on it, making it hard to breathe. "We can't leave it like this," I muttered, my voice sounding distant even to myself. Joe snapped his head toward me. "What do you mean, leave it like this? Evan, we're cops, not archaeologists. This is something else. This isn't our problem." I didn't respond. I couldn't. My mind was spinning. I wasn't even thinking about the job anymore, or what we were supposed to do. All I knew was that we'd found something we shouldn't have, and leaving now felt like walking away from a lit fuse. I knelt down again, this time more careful, brushing away the dirt around the edges of the slab. It was smooth, cold to the touch, and as my hand traced the symbols, I could feel a slight vibration beneath my fingers, like the ground was alive. "What are you doing?" Joe's voice cracked, full of panic now. "We gotta report this, man. This is way above us." I nodded, but I didn't stop. I didn't even know why. The whispers had faded, replaced by this strange hum that I could feel more than hear, like it was resonating from the earth itself. I knew Joe was right. We weren't equipped to deal with this. Hell, I wasn't even sure what this was. But something about the way the symbols curved, the way the stone felt under my hands, it was like I was unlocking something. I hated how that thought crept into my head, but once it was there, it wouldn't leave. Suddenly, the ground beneath us shifted. Not a full-blown quake, but enough to make both of us stumble. I fell forward, catching myself on the slab, my palms flat against the stone. That's when it hit me, the hum. It surged through my arms, up into my chest, like a low, steady pulse. My vision blurred for a second, and I swore I saw the shadows in the trees shift, like something was moving just out of sight, watching us. Watching me. Joe grabbed my arm, pulling me up. "Evan, stop. We're done. Let's go." He was almost shouting, his voice full of desperation. I wanted to listen. I wanted to get out of there, just like him. But I couldn't shake the feeling that if we left, something worse would happen. Something far worse than what we were dealing with now. I yanked my hand off the stone, the strange pulse still thudding in my fingertips. Joe was gripping my arm so hard it hurt, but I barely noticed. I could feel something, deep in the pit of my stomach, telling me to back away, to run. Joe was right. We didn't belong here, but something in me wouldn't listen. I glanced at him, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He was looking at me like I'd lost my mind. Maybe I had. "Evan, for God's sake, let's go," he barked, shaking me. His voice snapped me out of whatever trance had taken hold. I stood up, legs shaky, my hands still tingling from that strange energy. I didn't know how to explain it, but it felt like we were standing at the edge of something far worse than an old grave or forgotten symbols. I took a step back, and that's when the slab shifted. It didn't move much, just an inch or two, but enough for both of us to freeze. The humming I'd felt before intensified, now vibrating through the air around us. Joe stumbled back, his eyes wide with panic. "What the hell did you do?" he gasped, backing away from the stone like it was about to swallow him whole. "I didn't." I started, but the words stuck in my throat. The ground beneath us trembled again, more violently this time. Something was rising, not the slab itself, but the feeling. The hum grew louder, sharper, filling my head until it was all I could hear. It was like the whole field was vibrating, like the earth was shaking off centuries of stillness. I looked down at the crack that had appeared beneath the stone. Dark, jagged, like a wound in the earth. My heart pounded as I watched, almost hypnotized as the crack spread. And then I saw it, something moving beneath the stone. Not shadows, not dirt. Something solid, shifting beneath the surface, pushing up against the slab. Joe let out a strangled cry and bolted, scrambling up the side of the pit, his hands clawing at the dirt. I wanted to follow him. I should have followed him. But I couldn't take my eyes off the crack. There was something there, just out of sight, something that had been waiting for us to dig it up. The hum turned into a low, steady moan, like the earth itself was crying out. The slab shifted again, and I saw it, a hand. Pale, skeletal, rising from the dirt, its fingers curling around the edge of the stone. I stumbled back, my legs barely working, as another hand appeared, then a face, hollow eyes staring up at me. It wasn't human, not anymore. Whatever it had been, it was long gone. I tripped, fell back into the dirt as the thing pulled itself up, its bones creaking, dust falling from its skull. It turned its head, slowly, as if it was seeing light for the first time in centuries. Its mouth opened, and the hum stopped. Everything stopped. For a second, there was nothing but silence, that awful, choking silence. Then, the whispers returned, louder now, clearer, like they were right next to my ear. "You brought us back." I scrambled to my feet, legs trembling beneath me. Joe was gone. The shadows around the edge of the trees were moving again, but now they weren't hiding. They were watching, waiting. I ran, not looking back, not stopping until I reached the truck. I don't remember driving. All I know is I made it home, but it didn't matter, because I can still hear them. Every time I close my eyes, every time I pass that damn farm, they're still there, waiting for me to come back. And deep down, I know I will. I won't have a choice. Night shifts can play tricks on your mind, but there are some things even years on the force don't prepare you for. It was a regular patrol night, the kind that feels endless, where the radio crackles with static and your only company is the hum of the engine. I had driven that stretch of Route 45 1,000 times, a back road barely lit by a few scattered streetlights, more often than not deserted after midnight. There's a stillness that settles in after the small hours, and you get used to the monotony, but not that night. I first saw the car a few weeks ago, tucked in just beyond the curve, headlights dim, almost like it didn't want to be noticed. At first glance, it looked like an old patrol car, the kind the department phased out decades ago. The weird thing was, it moved, slowly, like it was shadowing me, keeping its distance. My gut told me to stop, but I dismissed it. Long shifts do that to you. Your eyes play games. I kept driving. The next few nights, I couldn't shake the image. I tried telling myself it was nothing, maybe an old cop car someone was restoring, just out for a cruise. But why at that hour? Why on my route? And every time I slowed down, it would vanish. No screech of tires, no sudden acceleration, just gone. It got to the point where I was waiting for it, scanning the road ahead, knowing it would show up. It always did. I mentioned it to Daniels over coffee one night at the precinct. He gave me a look like I'd lost it. "You sure you weren't nodding off behind the wheel?" he asked, half smirking. I laughed it off, but deep down, it gnawed at me. There's a fine line between what you imagine and what you know you saw. And I knew I wasn't imagining it. Then, last night, it happened again. The car appeared, just ahead, moving slow enough that I thought I could catch up. This time, I wasn't going to let it slip away. I hit the lights, sped up, and followed. It stayed in sight, the taillights flickering like they were fading in and out. My pulse quickened as I closed the gap. I could see the silhouette of the driver, an officer, in a uniform I hadn't seen since the old academy photos they have hanging in the hallway. I called it in. Unit 432, following what appears to be a vintage patrol car, no plates. Driver appears to be in uniform? There was silence on the other end, just a beat too long. Dispatch came back, a bit confused. No units in that area. Repeat, no active units. The car was just ahead, and then just like before, it was gone. 1 second it was there, the next, the road stretched out empty in front of me. The moment the car vanished, I slammed the brakes, staring at the empty road ahead. My heart was racing, and for a second I thought maybe I had blinked, maybe I missed something. But no, the road was bare, stretching out in the distance, lit only by my own headlights. There wasn't a sign of the old patrol car. Nothing, not even tire marks on the asphalt. I rubbed my eyes and sat there, engine idling, trying to wrap my head around it. I radioed back. "Negative, no contact made," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Dispatch asked if I needed assistance, but what was I supposed to say? That I'd been chasing a ghost car? "Negative," I repeated. "Just going to finish the patrol." I lied, of course. I didn't finish the patrol that night. Instead, I drove home, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously off. The next morning, I found myself at the station early, poking around through old case files. I knew the car was vintage, 70s era, maybe earlier. It had a distinct look, and something about the way it moved stuck with me, like it belonged to another time. I started asking around, seeing if any of the older guys had heard stories. Most of them shrugged it off, the way cops do when they don't want to admit they're rattled. But one guy, Hank, pulled me aside later. "You said it was an old patrol car, right?" he asked, his voice low, like we were discussing something forbidden. I nodded. Hank leaned in, glancing around the room before speaking again. "You ever hear about Officer Collins? Back in '76? The name rang a bell, but only faintly. Hank explained that Collins had been on a late-night patrol just like mine when he got caught in a chase. Some drunk driver blew through a stop sign, and Collins gave pursuit. The chase ended in a wreck, both cars careening off the road near the same stretch of Route 45 I'd been on. Collins died on impact. Thing is, Hank added, folks still see that car sometimes, usually late at night, same place. No one talks about it, but you ain't the first to see it." I sat there, absorbing what Hank said. It didn't make sense, but at the same time, it explained everything. My mind went back to that silhouette behind the wheel. I could still picture the old uniform, the way it sat unnervingly still, as if it was waiting for something, or someone. I didn't want to believe it. There had to be an explanation, a rational one. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I hadn't been chasing just any old car. I had been following something much worse, something that shouldn't still be out there. I wasn't sure what I was supposed to do with that information, but one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore it anymore. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Hank had told me. I was back on patrol, same route, but I felt like every shadow had eyes. My hands were tight on the wheel as I drove past the stretch where I'd seen the old patrol car. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those headlights again. There was nothing. Just the hum of the engine and the road stretching out in front of me. I told myself it was all just a story, something the old-timers passed around to freak out the new guys. But that didn't explain what I'd seen with my own eyes. And it didn't explain why my gut was telling me that tonight, something was going to happen again. Around 2 a.m., I spotted it. Same old car, headlights dim, creeping along the shoulder like it was waiting for me. My pulse spiked, but I didn't pull over. I just followed it from a distance, not getting too close. The car drifted ahead, moving slower than before, like it wanted me to catch up. The figure inside, he was still there, sitting stiff behind the wheel. There was something about the way his head was turned, as if he was looking at something in the distance, but not really seeing it. I radioed in, trying to keep my voice steady. "I've got eyes on the vehicle," I said, glancing at the clock. "Same location as before. No plates, no visual of the driver." I didn't mention it was the same damn car from the '70s. What was I supposed to say? As I followed the car further down the road, it suddenly veered off, heading down a side street I didn't recognize. My instincts were screaming at me to back off, but I couldn't let it go. Not this time. I turned onto the street after it, trying to catch up. The houses here were old, worn down, most of them abandoned. The car's taillights flickered in and out of view, disappearing around a bend. I felt this strange pull, like I was being dragged into something I couldn't escape. And then, just as suddenly as before, the car vanished. No screech of tires, no sign it had turned off. 1 second it was there, the next, it was gone. I stopped in the middle of the road, staring at the empty street ahead, feeling like I'd been led somewhere for a reason. But whatever that reason was, I wasn't ready to find out. Not yet. I radioed in again, my voice tight. Lost visual. No sign of the vehicle. I sat there for a minute, gripping the wheel, trying to shake the sense that something was watching me. Something that didn't belong. When I got back to the precinct, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd seen something I wasn't supposed to. My shift was over, but sleep was out of the question. I found myself pacing in my small apartment, trying to make sense of everything. I grabbed the old map of my patrol area, the one marked with every pothole and detour, and traced the route where I'd lost sight of the car. It wasn't just the car that bothered me, it was the man inside it. There was something disturbingly familiar about the way he sat, as if he was waiting for someone he knew well. The way he looked straight ahead, almost as if he was lost in thought, reminded me of the old stories Hank used to tell about the officer who died. I'd dismissed those stories as tall tales, but now they felt like they were closing in on me. Why is this happening now? I muttered to myself, staring at the map. Is this just some trick of the mind or something more? I couldn't deny that I felt a connection to those old stories. Maybe it was just coincidence, or maybe it was something more sinister. The idea of chasing shadows through dark streets was becoming increasingly unsettling. I decided to dig into the records, see if there was any truth to the old stories. I called up some colleagues who had been on the force longer than I had. Hey, you ever hear about an old patrol car that's been spotted around the old highway? Supposedly, it's been seen with a cop who died years ago. The response was what I expected, a lot of muttering and vague memories. Yeah, I've heard whispers, one of them said. Never paid much attention, though. The story goes that the officer was chasing someone and crashed. Some say his spirit never left the road. You know how these things are. I went back to the street where the car had disappeared. It was empty, just as before, but the darkness seemed thicker here. I drove slowly, scanning the area for any sign of the old vehicle. Nothing. Just the hum of my engine and the distant sounds of the city. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. I parked and got out, walking toward the bend where the car had vanished. I turned on my flashlight, the beam cutting through the blackness. The houses here were run down, their windows boarded up. As I moved closer to where the car had disappeared, I noticed something odd, a piece of metal glinting in the light. It was part of an old police badge, tarnished and bent. I picked it up, feeling a chill as I realized it was from the same era as the patrol car. This was no random occurrence. The badge seemed to be a clue, a piece of a puzzle I hadn't yet put together. I felt a knot tightening in my chest. Whatever was happening, it was clear that I was getting deeper into something far beyond routine patrols. The past wasn't just lingering, it was reaching out to me. The next few days were a blur. I couldn't stop thinking about that badge. It felt like a key, one that was unlocking something I wasn't prepared to face. My nights were filled with restless dreams of dark roads and shadowy figures. During the day, I pored over old case files and records, looking for any hint that might explain the car and the officer who'd been seen in it. I hoped for something mundane, but nothing fit. Then, one night, while driving my usual route, I spotted the car again. It was parked on the shoulder, just as before, its engine cold and the body covered in grime. My heart raced as I approached, my flashlight flickering in the dark. I saw the figure inside, unmistakably dressed in the uniform of a patrol officer from the 70s. This time, I felt a chill, not from the cold, but from the presence of something old and unresolved. I parked a short distance away and got out, keeping the car in view. The figure didn't move. I tried to remind myself that it was probably just a prank or an old vehicle left behind. But as I walked closer, the weight of the old stories about the officer's death bore down on me. The tales had painted him as someone who had never left his post. I had dismissed them, but now, faced with this reality, I felt a deep unease. "Hey!" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Can you hear me?" No response. I moved closer, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. When I reached the car, I saw the figure clearer. He was staring straight ahead, his eyes hidden in shadow. I tried the door. It was locked. I peered through the window and saw a dim, ghostly reflection of the badge I'd found. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't just about an old car or a dead officer. This was personal. I went back to my car, my mind racing. I pulled out my phone and began to search the records again. I was looking for any mention of this officer, any clues about why his presence was so persistent. And then I found it. The officer had been pursuing a suspect who had escaped the scene and was never caught. The case had gone cold, leaving behind unanswered questions and unfinished business. Returning to the road that night, I felt a mix of dread and determination. I drove slowly, my eyes scanning the darkness. I was searching not just for the car, but for answers that had been buried for decades. As I drove past where I'd seen the vehicle, the lights of my car illuminated a crumpled piece of paper on the road. I stopped and picked it up. It was a handwritten note, stained and faded. It read, "I didn't mean to, but he was my partner." The pieces were falling into place. The officer's ghost was tied to a tragic event, a betrayal or an accident that had left him bound to this road. He wasn't just a specter, he was a reminder of an unresolved duty. My role was no longer just about patrolling the streets. It was about confronting the past and bringing closure where it was long overdue. As I drove back to the precinct, I couldn't help but think about the weight of history and the shadows it cast. Sometimes, the past doesn't rest until justice is served. And in the line of duty, even the coldest cases have a way of coming back to life. Every badge carries the weight of its own stories, I thought, the words echoing in my mind. Some stories, though, are far from finished. Nothing ever goes exactly as planned when you're on the job, especially when you're dealing with old buildings that have their own secrets. The old police station was a relic of a bygone era. I was there to inspect the place one last time before it was officially shut down. The building stood with an air of resignation, its once bustling corridors now vacant and eerily quiet. I moved down the dimly lit hallway, the faint creak of my boots the only sound. The walls, covered in layers of chipped paint, seemed to watch me with 1,000 forgotten stories. I approached the cells at the end of the hall, each one a small, grim reminder of the station's past. As I walked past, I noticed something odd, a chill that didn't seem to fit with the temperature of the building. I shook off the feeling, focusing instead on the task at hand. These checks were routine, just a matter of ticking off boxes. It was when I reached the last cell, the one that had been decommissioned for years, that I heard it. Faint, but unmistakable. A rhythmic banging, like someone was pounding on the metal door. I stopped in my tracks, listening. The sound was punctuated by what seemed like desperate cries for help. My heart raced as I approached the cell, my flashlight casting long, jittery shadows on the walls. "Hello? Is someone there?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly, despite my attempt to stay calm. There was no answer, just the relentless banging. I peered through the small window in the door, but the cell was empty. My flashlight revealed nothing but dust and cobwebs. The banging continued, as if mocking my confusion. I stepped back, my mind racing. This station had been the site of a lot of old stories and legends, most of which I dismissed as just that. But this was different. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the pipes or some structural problem causing the noise. Yet, a part of me couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. As I left the cell, the sound abruptly stopped. The sudden quiet was almost as unsettling as the noise had been. I checked my watch. The time was creeping towards midnight. I made a note to look into the station's history, hoping there might be a logical explanation. But deep down, I knew there was more to this than met the eye. The next morning, I was back at the station, trying to shake off the unsettling experience from the night before. I'd made up my mind to investigate the history of the building, hoping to find some mundane explanation for the noise. The old station, built in the early 1900s, had seen its fair share of events. It wasn't unusual for old places to hold on to their pasts in strange ways. In the dim light of the station's records room, I flipped through old files and yellowed documents. The history of the building was a labyrinth of forgotten cases and faded memories. Among the files, I stumbled upon a report from decades ago, a case involving a prisoner named James Caldwell. According to the report, Caldwell had been left in the cell I'd visited. He was meant to be transferred, but somehow ended up forgotten there. His death was ruled an accident. He had died from dehydration and exposure. Reading the details, I felt a shiver. The report described the exact cell where I'd heard the banging. Caldwell's last days were marked by desperate attempts to get someone's attention, but no one had come. I could almost hear his cries as I read the document, the same cries I'd heard the night before. The file included statements from former officers. One, in particular, caught my attention. Officer Danvers had mentioned hearing sounds coming from that very cell, even after it had been sealed. His account was dismissed as stress-induced hallucinations. But Danvers's description mirrored exactly what I'd experienced. I decided to visit the old station again that evening, hoping to gather more evidence, or at the very least, to find some clarity. As I walked the deserted hallways, the familiar chill crept up my spine. I made my way to the cell, but this time, I wasn't alone. I had brought a small digital recorder with me to capture any unusual sounds. Standing outside the cell, I set up the recorder and took a deep breath. "If there's someone here, please let us know. We want to understand what happened," I said aloud, trying to keep my voice steady. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the walls. The feeling of being watched was more intense than ever. The moments ticked by slowly, each second stretching longer than the last. I strained to hear anything out of the ordinary, but it was just the hum of the old building's infrastructure. Then, a soft thud came from within the cell, followed by a muffled cry. My heart skipped a beat. I turned on the recorder and waited, the tension in the room palpable. What was happening here? Why did Caldwell's torment seem to echo through the years? As I left, the sense of unease grew stronger. I couldn't ignore the connection between Caldwell's tragic story and the eerie occurrences at the station. Something about it didn't sit right. I needed to know more. That evening, I returned to the station, determined to uncover the truth. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls, a stark reminder of the station's long-abandoned state. I carried a flashlight, a digital recorder, and my mounting unease. Each corner I turned seemed to darken the atmosphere even more, heightening the feeling that something was waiting. When I reached the old cell, I set up my equipment with meticulous care. The dust in the air sparkled in the beam of my flashlight, making the cell look even more desolate. I focused on the spot where I'd heard the noises before. With the recorder running, I spoke into it. "James Caldwell, if you can hear me, I want to understand what happened to you. Why are you still here?" I sat on a nearby stool, trying to keep my nerves in check. The only sound was the occasional drip from a leaking pipe somewhere in the building. My thoughts raced. I wondered if Caldwell's story had been forgotten intentionally, or if it was just an oversight. The cell's heavy iron door was slightly ajar, and I kept glancing at it, half expecting it to slam shut on its own. Minutes passed, and I started to doubt myself. Maybe the whole thing was a figment of my imagination, driven by the unsettling history I'd uncovered. But then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic banging coming from inside the cell. My heart quickened. I stood up, flashlight in hand, and moved closer to the door. The sound grew louder, more desperate. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely masking my fear. I peered into the darkness of the cell, but saw nothing. The flashlight's beams swept over the cold, empty walls. The banging continued, almost as if someone or something was trying to break free. My hands shook as I held the flashlight and the recorder. I realized the sound wasn't coming from the walls or the pipes, it was coming from inside the cell. I stepped back, trying to gather my thoughts. What if Caldwell's spirit was indeed trapped here, still trying to reach out for help, decades after his death? The thought was unsettling, but I couldn't ignore the connection between the historical account and the noises I was hearing. I decided to review the recordings immediately. As I walked back to my car, the tension didn't ease. The darkness of the station seemed to cling to me. Listening to the playback, my skin crawled as I heard the banging and a faint, tormented cry, barely discernible but unmistakable. Caldwell's plight wasn't just a story from the past, it was very much present. My mind was racing as I drove home, trying to piece together the fragments of the night's events. I felt a growing urgency to uncover more. The echoes of Caldwell's suffering were too vivid to ignore. Whatever was trapped in that cell seemed to be reaching out for understanding, and I was determined to find out why. I couldn't shake the feeling that something more was at play. The recordings from the old cell were unsettling. The distant cries and the rhythmic banging gnawed at me. I needed answers. I dug into the station's old records, hoping to find more details about James Caldwell and the forgotten incident that seemed to bind him to the cell. Hours of research revealed scant details. Caldwell had been a minor offender, arrested for petty theft. The records barely mentioned the circumstances of his death, other than he had been neglected in his cell. A few lines buried in the report noted complaints from fellow officers about eerie noises and a sense of unease around the cell. No one had paid much attention. It was dismissed as the building's creaks and groans. As I sifted through the files, a name kept coming up: Officer Danvers. He was mentioned in several reports as the one who first encountered the noises. His statements were brief, but they hinted at something darker. Danvers had transferred out of the station, shortly after Caldwell's death and never returned for questioning. I tracked down Danvers, now retired and living in a quiet town. The interview was brief but revealing. Sitting across from him in his modest living room, I felt a chill as he recounted his memories. "I remember the night Caldwell died," he said, his voice low. "The noises were real, Henry. They weren't just sounds. It felt like something was trying to communicate, trying to get out." "Why didn't you report it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Danvers looked away. "We had our share of strange incidents, and I guess we just didn't want to stir up more trouble. It was easier to dismiss it." His words hung heavy in the air. I couldn't shake the feeling that he was hiding something. Back at the station, I rechecked the cell and found something I'd missed before, a hidden panel in the corner of the cell. It was barely noticeable, almost as if it was meant to be overlooked. My heart raced as I pried it open. Inside, there was a small metal box covered in dust. I pulled it out carefully and opened it. Inside were personal items, a worn-out watch, a few letters, and a photograph of a young woman. The items were clearly old, and the letters were faded. It struck me that these might have belonged to Caldwell, or at least someone he cared about. The photograph was of a woman holding a child. Written on the back was a name and a date, dates that matched the approximate time Caldwell was imprisoned. I began to piece together Caldwell's life, realizing that he had been forgotten not just by the system, but by the people he loved. His final moments were spent in a cell that had become his tomb. The sense of urgency grew. I felt a deeper connection to Caldwell's story and a need to honor his memory. If the cell was still echoing with his final cries, it was my responsibility to uncover the truth and bring some semblance of closure. As I left the station that night, the feeling of being watched never left me. The station's darkness seemed more oppressive than ever, as if Caldwell's story had become a shadow over the building. The echoes of his suffering were more than just sounds. They were a plea for justice that I could no longer ignore. I thought I had pieced together the mystery, but as I delved deeper, the truth unraveled in ways I never expected. My visit to Danvers had given me leads, but it was clear now that Caldwell's story was far from over. I returned to the station, determined to investigate the forgotten cell one last time. That night, the station was empty, the shadows stretching long and dark. I approached the hidden panel with renewed focus. My flashlight revealed a narrow space behind it. The air was musty, thick with decades of dust. As I moved further inside, I noticed a loose floorboard, almost as if it were deliberately placed to be overlooked. With effort, I pried it open. Beneath the board, I found a small, hidden compartment. Inside were documents and a journal, clearly old. My heart pounded as I flipped through the journal. It was Caldwell's, his final thoughts, his last desperate entries. The journal detailed his fear and anger, but one entry stood out. It described a confrontation between Caldwell and a corrupt officer. Caldwell had been framed for crimes he didn't commit, and the corrupt officer had ensured his suffering. The more I read, the clearer it became. Caldwell had been wronged, and his cries for justice had never been answered. He wasn't just a forgotten prisoner, he was a victim of a grave injustice. The voices I'd heard were more than echoes of a tragic end. They were the remnants of a man betrayed. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. I spun around, but the room was empty. My breath quickened, and I noticed the temperature had dropped. The air felt charged, as if charged with Caldwell's pain. A cold draft swept through the station, carrying with it a distant, pleading voice. It was as if Caldwell was trying to communicate his story one last time. In a panic, I left the cell and searched the station for any other evidence. It was then that I stumbled upon a hidden room, one I hadn't noticed before. Inside were old files and photographs, confirming the corruption Caldwell had written about. The officer Danvers had mentioned, a name I had found in the files, was implicated in a series of scandals. It all tied together. I returned to Danvers's house the next day. This time, his demeanor had changed. He was nervous, avoiding eye contact. "I know what you found," he said abruptly. "Caldwell was just one of many. We kept things quiet to protect ourselves." I confronted him about the documents and the journal. His face went pale. "He was a good man, Henry, but the system was rigged. We did what we could, but there were too many of us involved. The cries you heard, They were his way of telling the truth, his final act of defiance. As I walked away from Danvers's house, the weight of Caldwell's story felt heavier than ever. The station still seemed haunted, not just by echoes of the past, but by the realization of systemic failure. Caldwell's story had been buried for too long, and now his plight was imprinted on my own conscience. The station's dark corridors would never be the same for me. The cries I heard weren't just haunting. They were a reminder of the injustices that still lurk in shadows. The horror wasn't just in the echoes of a forgotten cell. It was in the truth that had been buried, and the realization that sometimes justice comes too late. In law enforcement, we're often taught to look for the truth behind the surface, but sometimes the truth is more disturbing than we ever imagined. When I got the call about the missing girl, I was finishing up a routine shift. It was one of those typical nights where nothing seemed out of place. I barely had time to grab my gear and head to the location, an expansive forest that bordered the outskirts of town. The area was familiar to me, but I never imagined I'd end up here under these circumstances. When I arrived, a team of officers and volunteers was already on the scene. They looked tired, some of them clutching coffee cups as if they might drain any minute now. We gathered near the edge of the forest. The missing girl's name was Emily, just 10 years old. The family had reported her missing a few days ago, but search efforts had so far turned up nothing. We split up and ventured into the woods. As I walked, the dense foliage seemed to press in from all sides. Every snap of a twig underfoot made me flinch, and the occasional hoot of an owl only added to the tension. I tried to focus, but my mind kept wandering back to the little girl's face, her parents' desperate pleas. I reminded myself why I was there, to find Emily. Hours passed with no sign of her. Just when I was about to call it a night, I spotted her. At first, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. A girl was darting between the trees, her form a blur against the dark. Her clothes looked like what Emily had been reported wearing. I called out, but she didn't respond. Instead, she kept running, always a few steps ahead. I chased her, weaving through the trees, branches scraping my face. My breath came in ragged bursts, but I couldn't catch up. She was too fast, too elusive. Every time I thought I was closing in, she would vanish just ahead. It felt surreal, like something out of a nightmare. The forest seemed endless, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't reach her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she disappeared completely. Exhausted, I made my way back to the search command post, hoping for answers. But when I returned, I learned something chilling. Emily had been found dead weeks earlier. The realization hit hard. I wasn't the only one who had seen her. Other officers reported similar sightings during the search. The whole situation made no sense, and I was left with a heavy weight of confusion and dread. The next few days were a blur. I kept thinking about the girl I saw, Emily. Her image was burned into my mind, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't shake the feeling of her presence in the forest. My colleagues, of course, were skeptical. They dismissed my experience as exhaustion or imagination. I couldn't blame them. I was struggling to understand it myself. One evening, after several days of fruitless searching and mounting frustration, I decided to visit the forest alone. Maybe seeing the place again would help me make sense of what happened. I approached the edge of the forest, my flashlight cutting through the dark. The trees seemed more menacing than before, their branches twisting like gnarled fingers. As I walked, I tried to retrace my steps from that night. My thoughts raced. Why had Emily been running from me? Where had she gone? The deeper I ventured into the woods, the more unsettled I felt. I started hearing noises, rustling, soft and irregular, like something or someone was moving just out of sight. I stopped and listened, the darkness pressing in. My heartbeat quickened as I turned my flashlight towards the sounds. Nothing was there. I shook my head, trying to clear the tension. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself. But even as I spoke, a sense of dread settled over me, fuspang, like I was being watched. On my way back, I ran into another officer who had been part of the search team. "I've heard stories about this place," he said. "People say it's haunted. I don't believe in that stuff, but, well, I've heard things." His voice trailed off, and he looked away. That was the first time I heard about the rumors, but they only fueled my anxiety. The case remained unresolved. We never found Emily or any concrete evidence of what had happened to her. Each day felt heavier than the last, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking in those woods, something beyond explanation. The experience left me questioning everything. If Emily had died weeks before, who or what had I seen? And why did the forest still feel like a place where something was waiting in the shadows? Weeks passed since the search ended, and the case remained unresolved. I couldn't let go of what I saw. The forest was still haunting my thoughts. I decided to return to the woods during the day, hoping that sunlight would help me see things more clearly. I wanted to understand what I experienced, or at least find a logical explanation. Driving up to the edge of the forest, I felt a mixture of anticipation and anxiety. I parked my car and walked to the spot where I last saw Emily. The trees, now bathed in daylight, looked less threatening, but something about them still felt off. The feeling from that night lingered like a shadow I couldn't shake. I retraced my steps again, observing every detail. The underbrush seemed undisturbed, and there were no signs of recent activity. I tried to ignore the nagging thought that maybe I had seen things that weren't there. Yet, the eerie sensation didn't leave me. My flashlight lay heavy in my hand, even though the sun was shining brightly. Suddenly, I noticed a worn path leading deeper into the forest, almost as if it had been used recently. The curiosity got the better of me, and I followed it. As I walked, the noise of birds and rustling leaves seemed to fade. I could hear my own footsteps crunching on the dry leaves, each sound amplifying the sense of isolation. I kept expecting to see Emily, or at least a clue about her whereabouts. I stumbled upon a small clearing. At its center stood an old, abandoned cabin. It was barely visible through the thick trees. The cabin looked like it hadn't been used in years. The door was slightly ajar, and the windows were boarded up, except for a few gaps. I hesitated, but my curiosity drove me closer. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was musty, and a thick layer of dust covered everything. The place seemed untouched, save for a few random items: a rusted stove, a broken chair, and scattered papers. I looked around, feeling a mix of relief and disappointment. Nothing here seemed to connect with Emily. But then, I noticed something odd: a small, frayed stuffed animal in the corner. It looked out of place and vaguely familiar. The same kind of toy I thought Emily was carrying that night. My heart raced. I reached for the stuffed animal, feeling an overwhelming sense of dread. I looked around, half expecting to see Emily's face at the window, her eyes watching me. The silence was oppressive, and the atmosphere felt like it was closing in on me. I hurried out of the cabin, the stuffed animal clutched in my hand. I drove away quickly, unable to shake the feeling that I had just uncovered a fragment of something much darker. The case remains unsolved. I often wonder if I missed something crucial that day. The forest still feels ominous, a place where reality and something else seem to blur. Every time I drive past, I can't help but think that Emily, or whatever I saw, is still out there, waiting. Returning from the cabin, I tried to shake off the unease that had settled over me. Yet, that night, the darkness felt heavier. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the stuffed animal from the cabin resting beside me. I couldn't stop thinking about it. Why would Emily's toy be there? Was I missing something crucial? I reached for my phone and called one of the other officers who had been on the search. "Hey Mike, it's Danny. I'm still thinking about the case. Did you ever see anything strange during the search?" My voice was tight, barely masking my anxiety. Mike hesitated before answering. "Well, now that you mention it, a few of us saw something odd. Shadows moving in the trees, shapes darting between the trunks. It was like someone was there, but when we went to check, there was nothing." I sat up, my heart pounding. "Did anyone else report seeing a girl?" "Yeah, actually, a couple of guys did. They described her as a young girl in a white dress, but when they tried to catch up, she vanished." Hearing Mike's words felt like a punch to the gut. I wasn't alone in this. We'd all seen something, but what was it? I spent the rest of the night pacing, the images of the girl in the forest haunting me. I couldn't dismiss it as a trick of the mind. The way she moved, always just out of reach, it was too deliberate. The next day, I visited the local library to dig into the history of the area. I hoped to find some clue that could explain the unsettling events. I spent hours sifting through old records, newspapers, and even talking to some of the locals. No one seemed to know much, but one elderly woman mentioned that there had been an accident years ago involving a young girl. She didn't have many details, but the story sounded too coincidental. I returned to the forest one last time, driven by a desperate need for answers. The place felt different under the afternoon sun, less foreboding, but still unsettling. I made my way back to the clearing and the cabin. This time, I took a closer look at the stuffed animal, examining every stitch and tear. It was a standard toy, nothing out of the ordinary, yet it seemed to hold a dark significance now. As I was about to leave, I noticed something strange near the cabin, an old faded photograph partially buried in the dirt. I carefully picked it up, my hands trembling. The photo showed a young girl with a smile that looked eerily familiar. It wasn't Emily, but the resemblance was close. I felt a chill as I realized the photo had been there for a long time, hidden away, waiting to be found. My mind raced with questions. What was the connection between the girl in the forest, the photograph, and the toy? The more I dug, the more I felt like I was unearthing something that was meant to stay buried. I couldn't explain it, but I felt a growing sense of dread. The forest had become a place where reality and something else seemed to collide, and no matter how much I wanted to understand, I felt increasingly trapped by the mystery. Days turned into weeks, and I couldn't shake off the feeling of unease. The case was officially closed, but I couldn't let it go. I found myself replaying every detail of that day, trying to piece together the puzzle. It wasn't just about the missing girl anymore. It was about the inexplicable things I saw. I kept returning to the forest, walking the same paths, searching for any clue I might have missed. Each time I felt the same chilling sensation, like being watched from the shadows. The photograph and the stuffed toy seemed to mock me, hinting at a secret I couldn't grasp. One evening, as I walked near the clearing again, I noticed something odd. The ground was disturbed, as if someone or something had been digging. I followed the tracks and discovered a small rusted metal box half buried in the dirt. Inside, there were several old letters and a diary. The diary's cover was worn, but the name written inside stopped me cold. Emily Carter. Flipping through the pages, I learned about a young girl who had gone missing years ago, only to be found dead under mysterious circumstances. The entries were about a family who had been plagued by strange occurrences, their daughter often speaking of a shadowy figure she saw in the woods. The final entry was particularly unsettling. It spoke of a place where the lost are never found, a place where the darkness claims its own. I drove back to the forest with a sense of dread. The diary's words echoed in my mind. I went to the cabin and examined it one last time, determined to understand what was happening. As I was about to leave, a sudden thought hit me. What if the girl I saw wasn't a ghost or a figment of my imagination, but someone who had been lost and was now trying to reach out for help? That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing the same image of the girl, her face pale and desperate. I decided to go back to the clearing early in the morning, driven by a gnawing need to confront whatever was haunting me. At dawn, I walked the path one more time. The forest was eerily quiet. When I reached the clearing, I noticed fresh tracks leading away from the cabin. I followed them, my heart racing. The tracks led me to a small, abandoned house I hadn't seen before. Inside, I found old furniture and scattered belongings. It was a place long forgotten, yet something about it felt deeply familiar. In a corner of the room, I spotted a dusty mirror. As I approached, I saw something that made my blood run cold. In the reflection, behind me, stood the girl, the same one I had chased. But she wasn't just standing there. She was reaching out, her expression full of torment. I turned around, but she was gone. I realized then that the girl wasn't a spirit trapped in the forest. She was a part of the same dark secret, her presence lingering because of it. I never found the answers I was looking for. The case remained unsolved, and I was left with a chilling reminder of what I saw and experienced. The forest, the diary, the photograph, they all pointed to something I couldn't fully understand. But the fear of not knowing was the most terrifying part. What had I really witnessed, and why was it still haunting me? The mystery of the girl in the forest remains with me, a a constant reminder of a darkness that lies just beyond the edge of understanding. I was just wrapping up a routine patrol when the call came in. Dispatch had received reports of strange lights coming from an old, abandoned farmhouse out in the sticks. The place was supposed to be nothing more than a crumbling relic of the past, but now something had stirred it up. I grabbed my gear and set off, trying to shake off a feeling of unease that crept in with the call. The drive out was longer than expected. I navigated the narrow dirt roads, surrounded by dense trees that seemed to close in on me with each turn. It was a clear night, and the stars were bright, but they did little to dispel the growing tension in my gut. When I finally reached the property, the house was just as I remembered from the records: old, decrepit, and utterly unremarkable. The lights were nowhere to be seen. I approached the house carefully, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The front door creaked open with a push, and I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The interior was exactly as I expected: dusty furniture covered with sheets, cobwebs in the corners, and an old fireplace that hadn't seen a fire in years. But then I noticed something unsettling. The fireplace, despite being cold and covered in ash, had a few embers still glowing faintly. It was as if someone had just been here. I looked around, finding a coffee cup on a table, still warm, steam curling up from it. A chill ran down my spine. I wasn't alone. I called for backup, deciding it was best to have more eyes on this. As I headed back to my car, I glanced at the house one last time. My eyes widened in disbelief. The house was gone. The spot where it had stood was now a barren plot of land, completely empty. I rubbed my eyes, thinking maybe it was just a trick of the light, but no matter how much I blinked, the house didn't reappear. I stared at the space, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. It was as though the building had vanished into thin air. I returned to where the house should have been, my heart pounding. I searched the area again, but there was nothing. No sign of the structure, no traces of recent activity. Everything was just as it had been before, only now the house was absent. It left me feeling disoriented and deeply unsettled. I radioed in my report, but even as I spoke, I knew it sounded absurd. How could a house disappear without a trace? The eerie feeling that something had gone terribly wrong gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the image of that empty plot from my mind. It wasn't just the disappearance of the house that troubled me. It was the sense of something profoundly wrong. When my backup arrived, they didn't find anything unusual. I felt like a fool trying to explain what I'd seen, or rather, what I hadn't seen. "Are you sure you're okay, officer?" my partner Jake asked as we combed through the area again. "Maybe you just missed it." "I'm telling you," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "The house was right here. I saw it with my own eyes. Now it's gone." We scoured the land, but there was no sign of the structure or recent activity. The ground was undisturbed, save for our footprints. I kept finding myself glancing over my shoulder, half expecting the house to reappear, but it didn't. Jake, trying to be helpful, suggested that perhaps the house had been taken down recently, and I hadn't been updated on the change. It was a logical explanation, but it didn't fit with what I had witnessed. When we returned to the station, I dug through old records and archives. The house's demolition was indeed listed as having happened years ago. I even spoke to a few locals who confirmed that the house had been gone for a long time. Yet, I still had the vivid memory of the building, its lights flickering, the warmth of that coffee cup. None of it added up. Later that week, I drove out to the property again, hoping to make sense of it. The sun was setting, and the landscape looked different in the fading light. As I approached, I kept expecting to see the house reappear. It felt like a sick joke, but no matter how much I hoped otherwise, the land remained empty. The unsettling feeling grew stronger, and I couldn't ignore the gnawing doubt in my mind. What had I seen that night? It wasn't just about the house. The experience had left me feeling off balance, questioning everything I thought I knew. I returned home and couldn't stop replaying the night in my mind. I even found myself checking the land for days, hoping to catch a glimpse of the house, but it never appeared. It was as though the building had been nothing more than a figment of my imagination, or something far more disturbing. The more I thought about it, the more it gnawed at me. The house was real, wasn't it? Or had I been deceived by something I couldn't comprehend? The reports from the locals and the records didn't match my experience. It's been months, and every time I think about that night, I'm left with the same unanswered questions. I've come to accept that I may never understand what happened. But one thing is clear: some mysteries are better left unsolved. The more I tried to brush off what happened, the more my mind kept dragging me back to that house. It's not like me to be haunted by something I can't explain. I usually deal with facts, not phantoms. But this was different. The house and the things I saw didn't fit into any logical box. I decided to visit the site once more, hoping for clarity or at least a distraction. I drove out there late one afternoon. The property looked exactly as it had the first time I'd been there, empty and flat. But this time, there was something else. A peculiar chill in the air. It's funny, I never believed in such things, but as I walked the perimeter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I wandered around, checking every inch of the land, half expecting to find some clue that would make sense of everything. I noticed a few odd markings in the soil, scratches, like something had been dragged. They weren't there before, or at least I didn't remember them. The more I examined the marks, the more uneasy I felt. It was as if they were a part of a puzzle I couldn't solve. Back at the station, I tried to dig deeper into the house's history. The records were clear. The building had been demolished years ago, and there were no recent permits or constructions on that land. Yet my experience didn't match up with the facts. My coworkers were skeptical when I brought it up. "Maybe you were just tired," one of them suggested. I wanted to believe that, but the vividness of what I saw was too strong to dismiss. Late one night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying the scene in my mind, the house with its lights flickering, the empty space where it once stood. I went over the photos I took that night. Everything looked normal, but I couldn't shake the image of the house's facade from my memory. I wondered if I'd seen something that was never really there, or if something had manipulated my perception. I couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that this was only the beginning. I started hearing rumors about other strange occurrences in the area. People talking about lights and figures seen in places where they shouldn't be. I knew I wasn't the only one unsettled by what I had experienced, but knowing others were unsettled didn't make it any easier. I was left with questions that no one seemed to have answers to. The whole experience left me disoriented and questioning my own sanity. I might never figure out what happened that night, but I know this: I can't forget it. The house might be gone, but what I saw, what I felt, lingers. It's a reminder that some things defy explanation, and maybe some mysteries are better left untouched. The more I try to understand, the more I feel like I'm slipping into a place I don't belong. After that night, everything felt off. I couldn't stop thinking about the house. It became a ghost in my mind, always lurking just out of reach. I started combing through old records and newspaper archives, hoping to uncover something that could explain my experience. My gut told me there was more to this than just a figment of my imagination. One morning, I went to the local library. I pulled up old articles about the property. Most of them were mundane, lists of who owned the land and when the house was demolished. But I noticed a few pieces that stood out. There were mentions of strange sightings and odd noises reported by neighbors before the house was taken down. One article mentioned unexplained phenomena, but provided no details. That intrigued me. It seemed like I wasn't the only one who had seen something unusual. I decided to visit the nearby residents who had lived in the area when the house was still standing. Most of them were older folks, retired and settled into quiet lives. I approached one of them, Mr. Higgins, who had lived across the street from the property. His eyes widened when I told him about my experience. "You're not the first," he said, his voice trembling. "There were always stories about that place, strange lights, noises. Folks said it was haunted, but I never believed it." His reaction unsettled me further. I pressed him for more information, but he seemed reluctant to talk. "You should talk to Mrs. Jenkins," he finally said. "She saw something different." Mrs. Jenkins was a reclusive woman who lived a few miles away. When I visited her, she seemed wary, but agreed to speak with me. Her home was cluttered, and the air smelled of old books and must. She hesitated before saying, "I saw the house too, just like you described. It was there 1 minute and gone the next. But there was something else, something I couldn't explain." I asked her what she meant, but she just shook her head. "It's not something you can put into words," she said. "Maybe it's best left alone." Her reluctance made me more determined. I couldn't let this go. I continued my search, going through old municipal records and speaking with former officials. Nothing concrete came up, only whispers and vague references to odd occurrences. Each step only deepened the mystery and my growing sense of unease. As I drove away from Mrs. Jenkins' house, the night felt different. It was like a veil had been lifted, revealing something just beyond my grasp. I began to wonder if I was being drawn into something far larger than a simple case of mistaken perception. The more I uncovered, the more elusive the truth seemed. I was left with a haunting feeling that some truths are too unsettling to understand. The house may have disappeared, but its presence remains a dark question mark in my mind. My obsession with the house grew, gnawing at me like an unwelcome shadow. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something I was missing, something that would tie everything together. I returned to the site one last time, hoping to uncover something, anything, that would make sense of my experiences. The property was as barren as ever, with nothing but overgrown grass and dirt. I felt a mix of frustration and resignation. As I walked around, I noticed something odd, a patch of ground that seemed strangely compacted, as if it had been disturbed recently. I started digging, driven by a vague sense of urgency. What was I hoping to find? I wasn't sure, but I felt compelled to dig. Hours later, just as the sun began to set, my shovel struck something solid. My heart raced as I cleared the dirt away. It was a metal plate, old and rusted. I pried it open and found a small, locked box beneath it. The lock was rusty, but not too difficult to break. Inside, there was an old ledger, its pages yellowed and brittle. As I turned the pages, my hands trembled. It was a record of the house's history, an inventory of belongings, and a list of names. One name stood out: Sarah Thompson. She had been the last resident of the house before it was demolished. According to the ledger, she had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The final entry was chilling. House abandoned. Strange occurrences reported. My mind reeled. I had found the name of someone who had vanished in the very house I had seen. I returned to the local archives, searching for any additional information on Sarah Thompson. What I found was even more disturbing. Reports of her disappearance included mentions of lights seen from the house, sounds of movement, and unexplained disturbances, details that matched my experience perfectly. But the most unsettling detail was a note that she had been involved in occult practices, according to a former neighbor. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying everything in my mind. The house, the lights, the strange feeling. It all seemed to point to something I couldn't fully understand. The more I learned, the more the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit together, but the final picture was still incomplete. I was left with a gnawing fear that perhaps some things are better left unexplained. The case never made it to the media. I couldn't bring myself to share what I'd found. The house had vanished, leaving no trace but the lingering question of why. I realized that some mysteries are meant to remain unsolved, shrouded in darkness. As I drive past that empty lot now, the house still haunts me, not as a physical structure, but as a question mark in my mind, a reminder of the unknown that lurks just out of sight, always just beyond my grasp. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when James set out for his usual hike through the woods. We'd been living in this small town for just over a year, and he had grown fond of these trails. He liked the isolation, the escape from everyday life. I remember him saying how it gave him space to think. That was the last time I saw him, his figure disappearing into the trees as he waved goodbye. I thought nothing of it at the time. When the sun dipped below the horizon and he didn't come back, I began to worry. I kept glancing at the clock, each tick amplifying my anxiety. By the time it was dark, I was pacing the living room, my calls to his phone going straight to voicemail. I knew I had to call for help. I dialed the sheriff's office, trying to keep my voice steady as I reported him missing. They arrived quickly, bringing flashlights and a search dog, but the initial search didn't yield anything. The next morning, the search expanded. Volunteers from town joined in, combing through the forest. I tried to stay hopeful, but every step into those woods felt like stepping further away from him. The once familiar paths now seemed foreign, as if they held secrets I couldn't uncover. I found myself retracing James's steps, hoping to find something, anything, that would explain his sudden disappearance. Days turned into a week, and the search efforts grew more intense, but we found nothing. There were no signs of a struggle, no personal belongings left behind. The forest seemed to swallow up every trace of him. Conversations with locals turned up only vague mentions of past hikers who'd vanished, as if the forest itself had a way of making people disappear. Some began to whisper about a curse or strange happenings in the woods, but I couldn't let myself believe that. It wasn't until I visited the local library to dig into old records that I found something unsettling. An elderly librarian told me about eerie stories of people who had seen shadowy figures lurking at the edge of the forest. It seemed absurd, but her description matched the growing unease I felt as days passed. I went home that night feeling more troubled than ever, haunted by the thought that the very place James had loved might have turned against him. Every corner of our home felt colder. His absence was a constant presence, and I was gripped by an overwhelming fear that something was terribly wrong. I began to question every detail of our life here, each moment that might have led up to his disappearance. As the search continued with no results, I faced the dreadful realization that the forest was hiding something, a secret that might never be uncovered. I thought I was going mad. Each day without James felt like a descent into a nightmarish reality. I kept retracing his last known steps, hoping to stumble across something that would make sense of his disappearance. The forest, once a backdrop to our peaceful life, now seemed hostile and indifferent. I kept asking myself if I had missed something, a crucial clue, a hidden detail. One evening, while sifting through old newspapers at the library, I came across an article about a similar case from decades ago. A young man had vanished in these very woods, leaving behind no trace. The town had buzzed with speculation back then, but no resolution had ever come. I shivered as I read about the mysterious sightings and the supposed shadowy figures. Could this have happened to James? The thought was unsettling, yet it lingered in my mind. In desperation, I spoke to the librarian again, hoping for more information. Her face was lined with years of unspoken fears. "You need to be careful," she said softly, her voice trembling. "Some things in these woods are better left alone." Her words felt like a warning, but she didn't elaborate. I left the library feeling as though I had been given a piece of a puzzle without the full picture. The next morning, I found myself wandering the edges of the forest, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every rustle of leaves, every snapped twig made me jump. I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread. It was as though the forest itself was conspiring to keep its secrets hidden. I walked for hours, my footsteps muffled by the thick layer of fallen leaves. As the days dragged on, I noticed a change in the community's attitude. Some neighbors avoided eye contact, others seemed to whisper behind their hands. I started hearing rumors, strange stories about rituals and old beliefs that I had never heard before. At first, I dismissed them as local superstitions, but the more I heard, the more I began to question if there was some truth buried in these tales. One night, as I lay in bed, I thought I heard faint, rhythmic knocking coming from the woods. It was a sound so distant and irregular that I couldn't tell if it was real or just my mind playing tricks on me. I stared at the ceiling, feeling a growing unease. What if James was out there, somewhere in the dark, trying to reach me? The idea gnawed at my insides, and I knew I had to find out more, even if it meant facing whatever shadows lurked in those woods. The more I uncovered, the more unnerving everything became. One evening, I decided to visit the old cemetery on the outskirts of town. It was a place I'd avoided, but something drew me there. The cemetery was ancient, the stones weathered and leaning, as if they had stories of their own. I was hoping to find some clue that might explain why the town seemed so reluctant to help in James's search. I had just begun walking between the grave markers when a chill breeze swept through the area, making the leaves rustle and shift. The sensation felt like fingers brushing against my skin, but when I looked around, No one was there. I muttered to myself, trying to shake off the feeling. "Get a grip, Molly," I said aloud, but my own words sounded hollow in the dim light. A man appeared from behind one of the old tombstones. He was thin, with a weather-beaten face and eyes that seemed to hold a lifetime of secrets. "Looking for something?" he asked, his voice rough and grating. I flinched, startled by his sudden presence. "I'm just trying to understand why my husband vanished," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I heard there were some old stories about this place. Do you know anything?" He stared at me for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "The stories aren't for everyone," he said, before turning and walking away. His footsteps, uneven and slow, echoed off the gravestones, fading into the distance. As I left the cemetery, my mind was racing. The man's words hung heavy. What was it about the stories that were too dangerous to share? I couldn't ignore the growing sense that something was fundamentally wrong with the town. I felt like I was peeling away layers of a facade, revealing a dark reality underneath. That night, I found myself unable to sleep. The knocking sound from the woods had returned, louder this time. I lay in bed, my mind racing through possibilities. Could James be trying to signal me? Was he still out there, trapped or hidden, and trying to reach out? I needed answers, and the more I thought about it, the clearer it became that the town's silence was hiding more than just local myths. I resolved to dig deeper, no matter where it might lead. The days slipped by with an unsettling predictability. Each morning brought the same news of no progress, and each night seemed to stretch endlessly. I felt as though I was living in a loop, but with each repetition, the tension grew thicker. My desperation only deepened as I found myself drawn back to the forest, to the place where James had last been seen. One crisp morning, I ventured out again, this time with a determined sense of urgency. The forest was dense, the underbrush thick, and the path almost impossible to follow. As I walked, I heard the faintest sound of footsteps behind me. I turned quickly, but there was no one. My heartbeat quickened. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring to keep me from finding anything. I continued deeper, feeling the weight of unseen eyes. Each shadow seemed to shift. Each creak of a branch made me jump. "You're just imagining things," I whispered to myself, trying to stay calm. But it was hard to shake the feeling of being watched, like a presence was always just out of sight. After hours of wandering, I came across something that made me freeze. Buried under a thick layer of leaves and dirt was a small, rusted box. I pried it open, revealing old photographs and strange symbols. One of the photos showed a group of people gathered in what looked like the same forest, holding what appeared to be a ritual. The faces were obscured, but the images felt oddly familiar. I tried to make sense of the symbols, but they only made me more uneasy. I knew I had to show these to someone, so I took them back to the town. The reaction was not what I expected. People avoided eye contact and murmured in hushed tones. It was clear they were uncomfortable, maybe even scared. A few folks even suggested I drop the investigation and leave things be. The tension between me and the town grew palpable. The locals who had once been friendly now seemed distant and wary. I started feeling isolated, as if the very air around me was charged with hostility. "What are you hiding?" I asked one of the town elders, but she only looked away and said nothing. Her silence spoke volumes. It was becoming increasingly clear that the town was hiding something, and whatever it was deeply connected to James's disappearance. At this point, I was more determined than ever. I couldn't shake the thought that the town's past was intertwined with the current mystery. I needed to uncover the truth, no matter how dark or dangerous it might be. The only problem was, the more I uncovered, the more the town seemed to close in on me, and the line between reality and fear started to blur. The tension had reached a breaking point. The town's stifling atmosphere, my growing isolation, and the cryptic clues only deepened my resolve. I had to find James, no matter what lay ahead. It was clear the answers were in the forest, but the deeper I went, the more lost I felt. I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being pulled into something much larger than I had anticipated. One night, after a particularly disheartening day of fruitless searching, I received a letter. It was unsigned, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a piece of paper with coordinates and a brief message. "Find the truth, where shadows meet. My first instinct was skepticism. Another prank or attempt to mislead me, perhaps? But something about the message struck a chord. It felt as though it was meant for me, meant to push me forward. Against all advice and my own growing apprehensions, I followed the coordinates the next morning. The forest was eerily quiet, as if holding its breath. I pushed through the dense underbrush until I reached a hidden clearing. It was there, among the gnarled trees and overgrown grass, that I found James. He was sitting on the ground, staring blankly ahead, his expression vacant. "James!" I rushed to him, shaking his shoulders. His eyes slowly focused on me, but he didn't speak. He seemed to be in some sort of trance, completely detached from the reality around him. "What happened? Why are you here?" I asked desperately, but he only blinked slowly, his gaze distant. In a daze, I noticed something odd about the clearing. Scattered around were small, strange symbols, similar to those I had found in the box. As I looked closer, I saw people emerging from the shadows. They were the town's residents, those who had been so unwelcoming. They didn't seem surprised to see me. In fact, they looked almost relieved. One of them, an older man with a stern face, finally spoke. "We didn't want anyone to find out. We protect the balance between our world and the one that lies beyond." He explained in a tone that brooked no argument. James was brought here to prevent him from uncovering things that are better left alone. I was stunned. All the clues pointed to an elaborate conspiracy. "So, what is this balance? What are you really hiding?" I demanded. But the man just shook his head, and the others moved to block my way. The realization hit me like a cold wave. The town, the forest, and James's disappearance were all part of a much older and darker scheme. I understood then that James had been part of their plan, and so had I. My fear turned into anger and then into resolve. I needed to escape and expose the truth, but deep down I feared the forest would never let me go. The boundaries between reality and the strange, unsettling world I had uncovered had become dangerously blurred. When I first moved to Silver Lake, the town's calm facade promised a life of simplicity. I was eager to start fresh, leaving behind the noise and chaos of the city. But that tranquility had a dark undertone I couldn't ignore. It all started when I stumbled upon the old articles about the missing teens. I had heard whispers about them since I arrived, but the full story was buried under layers of local gossip and incomplete police reports. The disappearances happened in the 1980s. 5 high school students vanished without a trace. No bodies, no suspects, just an unresolved puzzle that seemed to haunt everyone who knew about it. I remember sitting at my kitchen table, flipping through the faded clippings. Each headline felt like a taunt. "Vanished without a trace," one read. "Silver Lake's dark secret." I had been a journalist long enough to recognize a story that needed uncovering, but this wasn't just about reporting. It felt personal, like I was meant to dig deeper. I could almost feel the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on me. I decided to start by talking to people who had lived here during the time of the disappearances. My first interview was with Margaret, an elderly woman who had been a schoolteacher. Her eyes, though weary, had a sharpness that hinted at hidden knowledge. "They were good kids," she said, her voice wavering. "Smart, full of life. No one knew what happened to them." Her gaze was distant, as if she was seeing something beyond the walls of her modest home. The more I talked to people, the more I sensed something was off. Residents spoke in hushed tones, avoiding eye contact. One man, who introduced himself as Tom, even warned me to drop the investigation. "Some things are better left alone," he said, his tone edged with a thinly veiled threat. As I walked away from his house, a chill ran down my spine. The streets seemed eerily empty, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The quiet of the town, which once felt peaceful, now seemed suffocating. The shadows between the buildings grew longer, more menacing. I spent the evening sifting through more files, the frustration building with every unanswered question. It felt like the town was hiding something, something dark and deeply rooted, and I was determined to find out what. The more I dug into the missing teens, the more I felt an uneasy chill settling over Silver Lake. I had begun to piece together a pattern, but something felt just out of reach. Each interview seemed to reveal a little more, but never the whole picture. It was like trying to catch fog with my bare hands. I decided to follow up on the stories about shadowy figures seen near the disappearance sites. Late one afternoon, I drove out to the edge of town, where the dense woods began. The forest looked different now, darker and more oppressive. I parked my car and walked a short way along an overgrown trail, hoping to find anything that might explain the mysterious sightings. The path seemed endless, twisting and turning with no clear direction. The trees stood tall and close, blocking out most of the light, making it hard to see far ahead. As I ventured deeper, I found a small clearing. It felt oddly out of place among the dense trees. I could almost hear the echoes of voices from the past, a faint murmur that seemed to grow louder the longer I stayed. There was nothing there, just a circle of disturbed leaves and a broken fence that seemed to guard nothing. My thoughts raced. Had this been a place where something sinister occurred? The air was thick with the weight of unanswered questions. I tried to talk to more locals, but each interaction felt more strained than the last. Several people avoided eye contact or changed the subject quickly when I brought up the disappearances. I met a man named Ed who, despite his initial reluctance, told me he'd seen something strange years ago. "I don't like talking about it," he said, his voice trembling. "But I saw someone moving in those woods late at night, always the same figure, always watching." His description was vague, but the fear in his eyes was real. Each piece of information seemed to lead to more questions. I began to feel the weight of the town's secrets bearing down on me. It wasn't just the missing teens that troubled me anymore. It was the growing sense that something malevolent was hidden just beneath the surface. The quiet town was hiding something, and the more I searched, the more it seemed to push back. One evening, I was working late, going over my notes when my phone rang. It was a call from an unknown number. "You're getting too close," a voice on the other end said before hanging up. My heart raced. What had I uncovered that was so dangerous? I couldn't stop now. The puzzle was too intricate, the pieces too elusive. If I stopped now, I'd never know what lay hidden in the shadows of Silver Lake. As the days stretched into weeks, the weight of the investigation pressed on me. Each new piece of information seemed to only complicate things further. One night, while sifting through old newspaper clippings, I stumbled upon an article about a local school teacher, Mrs. Whitmore, who had left Silver Lake abruptly in the 1980s. Her departure was sudden, and there was little information about where she went or why. I decided to track down her current location, hoping she might have insights into the town's dark past. The small town where Mrs. Whitmore had moved was nothing like Silver Lake. It was quiet, almost too quiet. I found her in a modest house on the outskirts where she lived alone. When I introduced myself and mentioned Silver Lake, her demeanor shifted instantly. Her eyes widened and her voice grew strained. "I haven't talked about that place in years," she said. "What makes you want to dig up old ghosts?" Her reaction was unsettling, like she was holding back a flood of memories she was terrified to face. I pressed on, explaining my investigation into the missing teens. "I heard things," she admitted reluctantly. "Strange rumors. People whispered about a cult or something. I didn't believe it then, and I'm not sure now." Her words were clipped, her gaze drifting to the window as if expecting someone to appear. I could see the fear in her eyes, a fear that mirrored my own growing unease. She mentioned a name, Jameson, but wouldn't elaborate before abruptly ending our conversation. I left with more questions than answers. Back in Silver Lake, I began looking into the name Jameson. It led me to an old, decaying mansion on the outskirts of town. The building had been abandoned for decades, but I noticed it was frequently mentioned in the rumors surrounding the disappearances. I approached the mansion cautiously, my flashlight cutting through the dense darkness. The windows were boarded up, and the front door creaked ominously as I pushed it open. Inside, the mansion was a maze of rotting wood and dust-covered furniture. The air was stale, filled with the faint scent of mildew. I felt an odd sensation of being watched, a prickling on the back of my neck. I searched through the rooms, finding nothing of particular interest until I reached the basement. The stairs groaned under my weight, and the basement was filled with old furniture and boxes. As I rummaged through the boxes, a loose floorboard caught my attention. Underneath the board, I discovered a hidden compartment filled with old documents and photographs. Many of the photos were faded, but one showed a group of people gathered in front of the mansion, their faces obscured. I could make out a few faces that seemed eerily familiar, including one with a striking resemblance to Jameson. My heart raced. It felt like I was peeling back layers of a very dark secret. My findings made it clear the town had been hiding something significant for decades. Each clue I uncovered only deepened the mystery, and the threats I received made me wonder how close I was to the truth. The fear that had been lurking just below the surface now gripped me more tightly than ever. I was walking a tightrope between revelation and danger, and it felt like every step brought me closer to a truth that someone wanted to keep buried. The basement in the old mansion had become my sanctuary of sorts. Each day, I returned to sift through the documents I had found. The photographs were haunting, blurred faces and shadows of what appeared to be rituals. The name Jameson appeared frequently, and it became a dark obsession. Each time I uncovered a new detail, the weight of the mystery grew heavier. One evening, as I was examining a particularly old ledger, a knock on the door startled me. I opened it to find a man standing there, dressed in a dark coat and fedora. He introduced himself as Mr. Turner, a historian with an interest in local legends. He claimed he had information that might help. I let him in, though my instincts were on high alert. The way he looked around the room with an uneasy expression made me question his intentions. "I've heard about your investigation," Turner said, glancing nervously at the documents spread across the table. "This town has always had its share of secrets. You're treading on dangerous ground." His voice was barely above a whisper, and his eyes darted to the old photographs. "There are stories, rumors about a group that's been operating in the shadows. They're not just myths." I pressed him for more information, but he hesitated, clearly weighing his words. "There are people who don't want this story coming to light," he finally said. "They'll stop at nothing to keep their secrets hidden." Turner's warning felt like a cold wind against my skin. He left as abruptly as he had arrived, leaving me with more questions than answers. Late that night, as I reviewed my notes, I noticed a pattern emerging. The dates and locations of the disappearances seemed connected to specific lunar phases. I pulled up an old map of the town and began to overlay the data. The coincidence was too precise to ignore. It suggested that the disappearances might be linked to some sort of ritual or event occurring in tandem with the moon's cycles. My thoughts were interrupted by the sound of my phone ringing. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Sarah Miller. A voice on the other end said, "You're getting too close. Stop now if you value your safety." The voice was distorted and the line went dead before I could respond. Fear gripped me, but I couldn't stop now. I had to see this through to the end, no matter the risk. The next day, I decided to visit the locations from the old photographs, hoping to find more clues. As I drove to the outskirts of Silver Lake, the landscape became increasingly desolate. The places I visited seemed frozen in time, abandoned and eerie. In one location, an old rusted fence with an overgrown path behind it caught my attention. I followed the path, my flashlight barely piercing the thickening darkness. There, hidden among the trees, I found what looked like a makeshift altar, covered in grime and cobwebs. Symbols and faded drawings adorned the surface. My heart raced as I realized this was where the rumors of a cult had started. The altar was cold, and the air around it felt oddly heavy. The realization hit me hard. The investigation wasn't just about missing teens. It was about uncovering a deeply entrenched and malevolent force that had been hiding in plain sight. Every new discovery deepened the mystery and the danger. I felt like I was being drawn into a web of deceit and terror, with each step revealing just how entangled Silver Lake was in this dark conspiracy. My own safety was becoming increasingly uncertain, but there was no turning back now. The truth was within reach, but the deeper I dug, the more perilous the journey became. The only question left was, how much more was I willing to risk to uncover what lay hidden beneath the surface? I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The eerie sense of being followed intensified with every passing day. I knew I was on the brink of uncovering something huge, but the risks were mounting. The night was falling fast as I reviewed the information I had gathered, trying to piece together the final fragments of the puzzle. The old mansion loomed before me, its decaying walls and broken windows adding to the sense of dread. I had arranged to meet Turner again, hoping he might shed more light on the cryptic symbols I had found. His previous warning echoed in my mind, but curiosity drove me forward. I arrived at the mansion earlier than expected and decided to explore one last time before he showed up. As I wandered through the dust-covered rooms, I stumbled upon a hidden door behind a tattered curtain. The hinges creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I hesitated for a moment. The air was thick, each step echoing loudly in the confined space. As I descended, my flashlight's beam struggled against the encroaching gloom. The basement was a large, underground chamber. It was filled with strange artifacts, ancient books, rusty chains, and a large map pinned to the wall. It was then that I noticed something chilling. The map detailed not only the locations of the disappearances, but also connected them to a larger network of tunnels stretching beneath Silver Lake. I was engrossed in examining the map when I heard footsteps approaching. My heart raced as I hid behind a stack of old crates. Turner appeared at the bottom of the stairs, his face pallid under the flickering light. He carried a briefcase and set it down near the map. "Sarah, you shouldn't have come here," he said quietly, almost in a resigned tone. "They're closer than you think." "What are you talking about?" I asked, stepping out from my hiding spot. Turner looked at me with a mixture of fear and determination. "The people behind this, they're not just a cult. They've infiltrated every part of this town. The disappearances were part of a larger plan." Before I could respond, a group of men in dark clothing burst into the basement. Their faces were hidden behind masks, but their intentions were clear. I tried to make a run for it, but they grabbed me before I could reach the stairs. I struggled, but their grip was unyielding. Turner, looking defeated, tried to intervene, but was quickly subdued. One of the men, their leader by the look of it, approached me. "You were getting too close," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "These kids were never just missing. They were part of a broader scheme to traffic people. They're kept here, beneath Silver Lake, to be used as pawns." The realization hit me like a jolt of electricity. The people I thought were missing had been trapped in these underground tunnels all along. My mind raced, thinking of the terrified faces of those adolescents, trapped and helpless. The leader continued, "We've been protecting our operation for decades. Your curiosity has put everything at risk." With Turner incapacitated and the men preparing to move me, I knew I had to act fast. In a desperate attempt, I grabbed a nearby metal rod and swung it at the nearest man. The chaos that ensued was intense. I fought my way through, using every ounce of strength and willpower. The underground chamber seemed to close in around me, each second feeling like an eternity. Eventually, I managed to escape the clutches of the men. I fled up the stairs and burst out of the mansion into the cold night air. My heart was pounding, and my mind was reeling from the horrifying truth I had uncovered. I had to expose what I had discovered, despite the danger, despite the threats. Silver Lake's dark secret needed to be revealed to the world, no matter the cost. As I made my way back to my car, I glanced back at the mansion. The sense of dread still lingered, but now it was mixed with a grim determination. The nightmare I had uncovered was just beginning to surface, and I knew the real battle was about to start. My next steps would be crucial in bringing this twisted truth to light and ensuring that those responsible would face justice. I've been a forest ranger in Pinewood for over a decade. It's a peaceful job, well, usually. Last week, something strange started happening that I can't quite explain. It all began with a call from a rookie ranger named Kevin. He'd just come back from a routine patrol, his voice trembling as he recounted something that made my gut churn. He described an old staircase in the middle of a clearing, far from any old structures. Kevin said it looked like it had been there for ages, its wood weathered and cracked. I dismissed it at first as a prank or an old relic someone left behind, but when more reports came in, I knew I had to investigate. I set out alone, determined to see this staircase for myself. I followed the coordinates Kevin had given me. The forest was dense, and the path grew narrower with each step. The usual sounds of the woods, chirping birds, rustling leaves, seemed muted. I couldn't shake off the feeling that something was off. When I finally arrived at the clearing, there it was, a rickety staircase standing alone, like it had been forgotten by time. It wasn't just its isolation that disturbed me. It was the way it seemed almost to pulse with an odd energy. The wood creaked, though there was no wind. I took a deep breath and approached it. As I climbed the first few steps, the sensation of being watched hit me. I couldn't see anyone, but I felt eyes on my back, scrutinizing every move I made. I managed to take a few more steps before something happened that I can't easily explain. The ground seemed to shift beneath me. My vision wavered, and the surroundings started to blur. The trees around me appeared to stretch and warp, their branches elongating into grotesque shapes. My mind raced. Was it exhaustion? A trick of the light? I forced myself to climb back down, shaking as I reached the bottom. Later, as I sat in the ranger station, I couldn't stop replaying the scene in my mind. I tried to rationalize it, but the unease lingered. Kevin's report had been clear. There were more of these staircases, and they were all scattered through the forest. I had to investigate further, but a part of me dreaded what I might uncover. The feeling that I'd stumbled onto something deeply unsettling wouldn't leave me. I couldn't shake the sense that these stairs were just the beginning of a much darker mystery. After that unsettling experience with the staircase, I couldn't shake off the sense of dread. I decided to dig deeper into the reports Kevin and others had made. Each account painted a similar picture: a lone staircase, appearing suddenly in the woods, followed by inexplicable disturbances. The more I read, the more I felt a knot tightening in my chest. Something about this felt profoundly wrong. I met with Kevin the next morning to discuss our next steps. "Did anything happen after you saw the staircase?" I asked him, trying to gauge if he had experienced anything beyond the strange feelings he described. Kevin's face paled as he recounted his experience. I heard these weird, muffled noises, like someone was trying to talk to me far away. And then when I tried to leave, I couldn't remember the way back. I was disoriented, like I'd been walking in circles for hours. His words only fueled my unease. I decided to accompany him back to the location to see if we could find more clues. As we trekked through the forest, I could sense Kevin's anxiety. He kept glancing over his shoulder, as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge from the shadows. When we reached the clearing, the staircase was still there, just as I remembered. The air felt different now, heavier, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I examined the steps more closely, but there was nothing unusual, no markings or symbols that would explain their appearance. As Kevin and I stood there, I heard a sudden crash nearby. We both jumped. Kevin's eyes were wide. "Did you hear that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound calm, though my heart was racing. I scanned the area, but saw nothing. "Let's check it out." We followed the sound, our flashlights cutting through the growing darkness. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. My mind raced with thoughts of what could be lurking in the shadows. The sounds seemed to come from all directions, growing louder and more chaotic. It felt like we were being watched, our every step scrutinized. Finally, we reached a small, dilapidated cabin that neither of us remembered from previous patrols. The door was slightly ajar, creaking with every gust of wind. I hesitated, but something compelled me to push it open. The interior was dark and musty, filled with old furniture and forgotten items. "What is this place?" Kevin whispered, peering inside. "I don't know, but we need to be careful," I said, my voice low. The hairs on my arms stood on end. Something was wrong here, something beyond the ordinary. The cabin seemed to hold its own secrets, and I had a feeling we were about to uncover something disturbing. As we stepped inside, a chill ran down my spine. I knew that whatever was going on with these stairs, it was more than just a series of strange coincidences. It was a mystery that promised to unravel further into darkness, and we were just beginning to scratch the surface. The inside of the cabin was dark, with only the faint light from our flashlights slicing through the gloom. The musty smell of decay hit me immediately, mingling with the scent of damp wood. I could barely make out the outlines of old furniture covered in dusty sheets. As we moved further in, my footsteps echoed strangely, amplifying the uneasy silence. Kevin's flashlight beam jittered around the room, revealing an old, rusty stove in one corner and a rotting table stacked with yellowed newspapers. "This place gives me the creeps," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah, it's unsettling," I agreed, trying to keep my voice steady. My eyes were drawn to a series of strange marks on the walls. They looked like scratches, but their patterns were too deliberate to be random. "Have you seen anything like this before?" Kevin shook his head. "No, but I don't like it. It feels like we're not alone." I couldn't argue with that. The air seemed to thicken around us, each creak of the floorboards louder than the last. I approached the wall to inspect the scratches more closely. They formed a crude, almost ritualistic pattern. My hand brushed against something soft, making me flinch. It was an old, moth-eaten curtain. I pulled it aside and found a door hidden behind it. It was slightly ajar, revealing a staircase leading down into darkness. "Are you thinking what I'm thinking?" Kevin asked, his voice trembling. I took a deep breath. "Yeah, let's see where this leads." We descended the stairs cautiously, the air growing colder with each step. The staircase creaked under our weight, the sound unsettling in the dark. I could hear Kevin's breathing grow heavier. My own heart pounded in my chest, each thud echoing the tension between us. At the bottom, we found ourselves in a narrow, dimly lit cellar. The walls were lined with old shelves, cluttered with broken jars and rotting wood. The beam of my flashlight fell on a series of dusty old books. One in particular caught my eye. It was a large, leather-bound volume with strange symbols on the cover. "What's that?" Kevin asked, his curiosity momentarily overcoming his fear. "I don't know, but it looks important," I said, carefully picking up the book. As I opened it, a cloud of dust billowed out, and I saw that the pages were filled with cryptic symbols and handwritten notes. The handwriting was shaky, almost frantic, with phrases like escape, trapped, and never let go. I could feel a chill run down my spine. The room seemed to close in on us. The book was clearly significant, but its meaning was elusive. I flipped through the pages, trying to make sense of the scribbles. Then I noticed a loose sheet of paper tucked between the pages. On it was a drawing of a staircase surrounded by crude, dark figures. "Look at this," I said, showing Kevin the drawing. His face paled as he stared at the figures. "These look like the same kinds of things people have reported seeing around the stairs." Kevin swallowed hard. "So, what does it mean?" Before I could answer, we heard a distant, muffled sound coming from upstairs. It was a low, rhythmic thumping, like someone or something was moving around. I glanced at Kevin. His eyes were wide with fear. "We need to get out of here," I said urgently. I grabbed the book, and we started back up the stairs, the thumping sound growing louder and closer. The sense of being watched was overwhelming. As we reached the top, I glanced back at the cellar, which seemed to have darkened even more, as if it was trying to keep us inside. Back outside, the forest was eerily quiet. The only sound was the crunch of leaves underfoot as we hurried away from the cabin. My mind raced with questions, but I knew one thing for sure. Whatever was happening with these stairs, the answers lay buried deep in the shadows, and we were just beginning to uncover them. I hadn't slept well that night. The book from the cellar was on my mind, its cryptic symbols and frantic notes swirling around in my thoughts. I knew we needed answers, but the more I thought about it, the more I felt like we were teetering on the edge of something we couldn't fully comprehend. The next morning, I met up with Kevin at the ranger station. His face was as drawn as mine. "Did you sleep at all?" he asked, his eyes betraying his exhaustion. "Not really," I replied, rubbing my temples. "I keep thinking about the drawing in that book. Those figures, they didn't look like anything I've ever seen. It's like they were meant to be seen as a warning." Kevin nodded. "I agree. We need to figure out what's going on with these stairs. We've seen how people react when they come across them, the weird things they experience. It's more than just fear." We decided to revisit the cabin, armed with more equipment and a clearer plan. This time, we were more cautious. The forest seemed to close in around us as we approached. Every shadow felt menacing, every creak of the underbrush unsettling. As we entered the cabin, I felt the familiar chill from before. The air was thick with the scent of mildew and rotting wood. I glanced around, trying to shake off the feeling that we were being watched. "Let's check out the cellar again," I said, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Kevin and I made our way back to the hidden door. I had brought a camera, hoping to capture something, anything, that would give us more insight. Descending into the cellar, the beam of my flashlight revealed the same dusty shelves and broken jars. The book was still where I had left it. I picked it up and opened it once more. The notes were as disturbing as I remembered. But then something else caught my eye. A passage that had been previously obscured. "The passage here," I said, pointing to the page, "mentions something about a cycle. It talks about how the stairs and the figures are part of a ritual to keep something contained." Kevin looked at the passage, his brow furrowing. "Contained? Contained how?" "I'm not sure," I admitted. "But it sounds like whatever these stairs are doing, it's not just random." As I pondered the passage, a sudden piercing scream echoed through the cabin. It was so loud that it seemed to shake the very walls. Kevin and I froze, our hearts racing. The scream was followed by a series of heavy thuds, like something or someone was moving around upstairs. "What was that?" Kevin's voice was shaky. "I don't know," I said, trying to stay calm. "But we need to find out." We rushed up the stairs, the sound of our footsteps mingling with the continued thuds from above. The cabin seemed to be shifting around us, the layout becoming more confusing with each step. When we reached the top, we found nothing. The living area was as we had left it, with only the faintest traces of our previous disturbance. "Maybe it was an animal," Kevin suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. "Maybe," I said, but I wasn't convinced. The scream had felt too human, too deliberate. We decided to leave the cabin and get out of the forest for a while. As we drove away, the unease didn't lift. The feeling of being followed, of being part of something we didn't understand, lingered. The cabin was now more than just a place. It was a part of a puzzle that was rapidly becoming more dangerous. The sensation that something was waiting for us, that the cabin had somehow become a trap, gnawed at me. As we left the forest behind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had merely scratched the surface of a much deeper, more sinister mystery. A few days passed, and I thought I was starting to get a grip on things. But every night, I'd wake up with that scream echoing in my head. It wasn't just the memory of the sound, it was the feeling it left behind. Like it was a warning or a signal, something I couldn't quite understand. Kevin and I decided to regroup and try to piece together what we had discovered. Back at the ranger station, I sat down with the book again, flipping through its pages. I could see the strain in Kevin's eyes as he scanned over the notes. "We've got to find out what this ritual is about," he said, his frustration evident. "Something tells me it's more than just old legends." I agreed, but I was worried. The forest had taken on a more menacing presence in my mind. Every time I thought of going back, a cold knot of fear tightened in my chest. But avoiding it wasn't an option. If we were to understand what was happening, we had to confront it head-on. We planned a return visit to the cabin, determined to delve deeper into the mystery. As we made our way back, I noticed something strange, a familiar, unsettling feeling. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. When we reached the cabin, I was struck by an eerie sense of déjà vu. The place looked the same as before, but the air felt charged, heavy with an unspoken tension. We re-entered the cellar, the flashlight beam slicing through the darkness. This time, I was focused on the corners of the room, hoping to catch anything out of place. Suddenly, I noticed something new. The book on the table was open to a different page, one I hadn't seen before. The symbols on this page were more elaborate, more intense. I felt a chill as I read the text. To release what has been contained, the cycle must be completed. The stairs are the key. "What does that mean?" Kevin asked, peering over my shoulder. "I don't know," I replied, feeling a growing sense of dread. "But it sounds like the stairs are part of some kind of mechanism." We decided to investigate further. As we ascended from the cellar, a faint but persistent thumping sound started up again. It was softer this time, almost rhythmic. We followed the noise to the back of the cabin, where we found a hidden trapdoor beneath a rug. With trembling hands, we pried it open. The space beneath was filled with dust and cobwebs, but something else was there, a set of old wooden stairs leading down into darkness. My heart pounded. The sensation of foreboding was palpable. "I think these are the stairs," Kevin said quietly, his voice strained. "We need to go down." I nodded, though every instinct in me screamed to turn back. We descended slowly, each step echoing unnervingly. The darkness around us felt alive, as if it was pressing in from all sides. Finally, we reached the bottom and found ourselves in a small, dimly lit chamber. In the center of the room stood a large, ornate mirror. It was covered in dust, but seemed to glow with an unsettling light. As I approached it, I noticed my reflection looked strange, distorted, and unnervingly different. "That's it," Kevin said, his voice barely a whisper. "The mirror must be part of this ritual." I reached out to touch it, and the moment my hand made contact, the mirror's surface rippled like water. The room around us shifted, and suddenly I was staring at a different scene, one that didn't make sense. I saw glimpses of the forest, but it was twisted, warped. Shadows moved in ways that defied logic. Kevin grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the mirror. "We need to get out now." We scrambled back up the stairs, our breaths coming in frantic gasps. As we exited the cabin, I looked back one last time. The mirror's glow seemed to seep into the forest, as if the forest itself was alive, reacting to what we had uncovered. The drive back was silent, the weight of our discovery settling heavily between us. The forest was no longer just a backdrop. It was an active participant in a horror that we had barely begun to understand. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was contained by those stairs and that mirror was now awake, and it was watching us. We never went back to the cabin. The forest seemed to have changed, and so had we. The mirror, the stairs, everything felt like a piece of a puzzle that was still shifting, still unfolding. And now, every time I see an old stairway or a reflective surface, I can't help but wonder what secrets lie hidden just beyond the visible. My shift that night began like any other. The forest was a familiar place, where the only sounds were the occasional rustle of leaves and the distant hoot of an owl. I had patrolled these woods for years, and the routine was almost comforting. The darkness outside my truck's headlights was thick and enveloping, but I knew this landscape like the back of my hand. As I drove deeper into the reserve, I noticed a subtle shift in the atmosphere. The usual sounds seemed to fade, replaced by a disquieting stillness. It was then I heard it, a high-pitched scream that cut through the quiet. It wasn't a human scream, but it wasn't entirely animal either. The sound was piercing and unsettling, sending a chill down my spine. My instincts urged me to turn around, but curiosity and duty pushed me forward. I parked the truck at a familiar spot and followed the direction of the scream. The deeper I ventured, the more distorted the trees looked. They twisted unnaturally, as if something had tried to wrench them out of place. The ground was scorched, black in patches amid the otherwise untouched forest floor. It didn't make sense. There hadn't been any reports of fires in this area. The scream continued, almost as if it were mocking my efforts to locate its source. I could feel my heart pounding, my breath quickening. "Just keep going," I muttered to myself, trying to stay composed. But every step felt heavier, each sound more disorienting. I searched the clearing for any signs of disturbance or recent activity, but found nothing. It was as if the forest had swallowed the answer whole. Suddenly, the scream grew louder, closer. It was like a phantom wailing right next to me, though I saw no one. Panic began to seep into my thoughts. What if something was out there, something beyond my understanding? I needed to get out. I turned around, forcing myself to move faster, the forest blurring around me. By the time I reached my truck, my hands were shaking. I fumbled with the keys, my mind racing. I didn't look back as I drove away, the scream echoing in my ears. I'd seen strange things before, but nothing that unsettled me like this. The encounter left me questioning the very fabric of reality. I knew I had to avoid that area from now on. Whatever was out there, it wasn't something I wanted to understand. I thought about reporting the incident, but who would believe me? The Forest Service, despite its reputation for dealing with the unknown, wasn't likely to take a report of a screaming noise seriously. I decided to keep it to myself and avoid that part of the reserve. If it was a prank, someone had gone to great lengths to make it seem real. If it wasn't, then it was better not to probe further. Weeks went by, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. Each patrol became an exercise in bracing myself for another encounter. My sleep was plagued with dreams of that clearing, trees twisting and warping, the blackened ground, and the scream echoing relentlessly. Even when I was awake, the image of that desolate space stayed with me, a constant reminder of something I couldn't quite understand. One night, I found myself back in the area. I had convinced myself it was just an irrational fear, a trick of the mind. The forest looked different in the daylight, less menacing, almost serene. I thought a daytime visit would clear my head. I parked a mile away and walked the rest of the way, hoping to prove to myself that there was nothing out of the ordinary. When I reached the clearing, it was as if nothing had happened. The trees were upright, the ground seemed normal. I almost laughed at my own fear. "Just nerves," I said aloud. But then I noticed something. The ground was scorched in the exact same way I had seen before. The trees were twisted, just like in my memory. Suddenly, I heard a rustling in the underbrush. My heart jumped. I couldn't see anything, but the sound grew louder, more frantic. I called out, "Is someone there?" My voice felt small and insignificant in the vastness of the forest. No reply came, only the unsettling sounds of movement. I turned to leave but felt a sudden weight of despair, as if something was pulling me back. I fled again, driven by a primal fear that I couldn't name. Each step away from the clearing was a step towards sanity, but the echo of that scream followed me, even in the safety of my truck. I can't explain what happened that night, but I know one thing for sure. There's something in that part of the reserve that's beyond my understanding. And whatever it is, I have no intention of uncovering its secrets. I couldn't stop thinking about that night. I kept imagining what I might have missed or misinterpreted. The image of the scorched earth and twisted trees was seared into my mind, and it made sleeping impossible. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw the clearing as it was, dark, twisted, and unsettling. It felt like the forest was taunting me, showing me something I couldn't quite grasp. Weeks passed since my last visit, and I managed to convince myself that it was a figment of my imagination. But deep down, I knew I couldn't ignore it. I wanted to understand, if not for my peace of mind, then at least to make sense of my own fear. That night, I decided to return. This time, I brought a few more tools: a flashlight, a camera, and a tape recorder. I wanted evidence, if only to prove to myself that it was nothing but a trick of the mind. As I walked towards the clearing, my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The forest seemed to close in around me, each rustle of leaves making me jump. My own breath sounded too loud, each exhale like a crack in the night's stillness. I felt like I was walking through a veil that separated reality from something much darker. When I reached the clearing, my heart sank. The area looked the same as before, except now the burn marks seemed fresher, more defined. I crouched to examine the ground, but as I did, the scream returned, loud and piercing. It was as if the sound was all around me, coming from every direction. I spun around, trying to locate the source, but saw nothing. "Who's there?" I shouted, trying to keep my voice steady. My words felt weak, swallowed by the darkness. There was no reply, only the echo of the scream bouncing off the trees. I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands trembling as I tried to focus the camera and record the sound. But the tape recorder crackled, the sounds on it distorted and unintelligible. I knew then that I couldn't stay. The fear was too overwhelming, more intense than the first time. I grabbed my gear and fled from the clearing, the sound of my hurried footsteps mingling with the distant echoes of the scream. I had no explanation, no reason for what I had heard. I only knew I needed to leave, to escape from whatever was haunting that place. Back in my truck, I replayed the recording and looked through the photos. Each image, each sound, felt like a cruel joke. Nothing showed up clearly, just distorted shapes and incoherent noises. I tried to reason with myself, to find a logical explanation. But deep down, I knew that whatever I had encountered that night was beyond my understanding. The forest had given me a glimpse into something unsettling, something that I was better off not knowing. I thought that returning to the clearing had somehow exorcised the fear, but it had only deepened it. For days, I was on edge, hearing the scream in my dreams and during the quiet moments of my day. The image of that burned ground and those twisted trees haunted me. Every little sound made me flinch. Each shadow in the corner of my eye seemed to flicker with something sinister. One evening, I decided to revisit the clearing, convinced I needed closure. I convinced myself it was just my imagination and that I needed to face my fears head-on. The forest was as dark and oppressive as ever. Each step I took felt like walking into a trap. I was aware of every rustle and crackle, my flashlight flickering like it too was frightened. When I arrived at the clearing, I noticed something new, a fresh set of footprints leading to the center. They were too large to be mine, and they didn't look like any animal tracks I was familiar with. I followed them, hoping they might explain the sounds I heard, but they just led me to the burned area again. My breath was ragged, my anxiety palpable. I tried to take a few more photos and record more sounds, but my equipment malfunctioned. The camera's lens fogged up, and the tape recorder seemed to pick up only static. Frustrated, I almost threw the recorder to the ground. In that moment, I felt something, an intense, choking presence. It was as if the very air around me was charged with a suffocating energy. I began to hear the scream again, but this time it was different. It was closer, more urgent, almost pleading. I wanted to run, but my legs felt rooted to the spot. I could see shadows shifting in the periphery of my vision, but every time I turned, there was nothing there. I was alone, or so I thought. As I stumbled back towards the forest's edge, I saw something that made my blood run cold. There, in the burned earth, were symbols, strange, intricate shapes I'd never seen before. They seemed almost alive, shifting slightly as if they were part of a living pattern. I took a quick photo before I fled, my mind racing with unanswered questions. Back home, I scrutinized the photos and tried to research the symbols. I found nothing that could explain them. The scream continued to haunt my dreams, and every shadow seemed to move with a life of its own. I started to question my sanity, wondering if it was all just stress or if something far more sinister was at play. I still hear that scream sometimes, a chilling reminder of that night. The forest, with its twisted trees and burned ground, holds secrets that I can't quite understand. I've avoided that area since then, but the fear never truly leaves. It's like the forest is waiting, watching, and sometimes I wonder if it will ever let me go. I tried to move on, to convince myself that the clearing was just a figment of my imagination, but the fear lingered. One night, a week after my second visit, I found myself unable to sleep. I lay awake in my bed, staring at the ceiling, the sound of that scream still fresh in my mind. My thoughts circled back to those strange symbols and the feeling of being watched. It was as if the clearing had imprinted itself on my very being. At work, I couldn't focus. My colleagues noticed my unease and tried to make light of it. "Still thinking about that scream, huh?" Jim asked with a half-joking tone. I forced a smile, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I avoided discussing it with them, knowing they'd probably brush it off as stress. One evening, I decided to go through the photos and recordings I took that night in the clearing. I scrutinized every detail, searching for something, anything that might explain the unexplainable. When I zoomed in on the symbols, they appeared to shift subtly, like they were never meant to be captured on camera. I tried to brush it off, but a gnawing doubt took hold. Was it possible the symbols had been meant for something or someone? Later, while reviewing the audio recordings, I stumbled upon a sound I hadn't noticed before. Beneath the static, I heard the scream again, but this time there was something different. It wasn't just a scream, it was as if it was saying something, a garbled message that I couldn't quite make out. I replayed it over and over, each time hearing a little more clearly. It sounded like, "Help me. Forever." I reached out to a local historian who specialized in the area's folklore. He was intrigued but cautious. "There are old legends about cursed places in these woods," he said. "Some say they're remnants of ancient rituals." His words sent chills down my spine. I didn't want to believe in curses, but I couldn't ignore the evidence. Determined to understand, I decided to return to the clearing one last time, armed with new equipment. This time, I brought an old map of the area, hoping to find something I missed before. As I approached the clearing, I noticed a new feature, a large stone, half buried and covered in moss. It wasn't on any of my previous maps. I examined the stone and discovered it had similar symbols carved into it. I felt a jolt of fear and curiosity as I traced the carvings. Suddenly, the scream returned, louder and more desperate. I looked around, my heart pounding. The forest seemed to close in on me. I realized the scream wasn't just a sound, it was a warning. Something was trying to reach out, to draw me in. I left the clearing, this time without a backward glance. The stone, the symbols, and that scream made it clear. There was something profoundly unsettling in those woods, something that I was never meant to fully understand. I haven't returned since, but the scream follows me, echoing in my mind. It's a reminder of something dark that lurks in the unknown, a haunting presence that will never let me forget.